have a question from Tanish Q. Hello, and also thanks a lot for your recent dive into Taoist philosophy. They were probably my favorite series of episodes on this podcast of thinkers other than Nietzsche. Well, thank you very much. I'm very glad. A lot of people seem to enjoy that, the Eastern focus, so that's good. I'm glad. Getting to my question, for some reason, the concept of the Overman has never appealed to me. How important do you think this concept is in Nietzsche's philosophy? Is it something he just mentions briefly in Zarathustra? To me, this is very important because I'm not really sure what Nietzsche is trying to do. Is his work dedicated purely to communicating insight, or is he trying to build a project here? If one accepts Nietzsche's revelations and clears away all past decadence values, then is there really still any need for Nietzsche? The limit that I've encountered is the question of, quote, why should I take you so seriously, especially if everything you have said is true? That arises after fully digesting his ideas. I would appreciate hearing what you think about this topic. Thank you, Tanish. I'm guessing Tanish is the first name and Q is the last initial. I hope I'm getting that right. You actually kind of have a lot of questions here. I mean, I see sort of the central connecting thread, but there's different issues at play in what you're asking. So usually my habit in answering a question like this is to put all the cards on the table first and give a direct answer to what you're asking, and then cover the nuances, because I like to give straight answers. So how important do I think this concept is in Nietzsche's philosophy? I mean, it's fairly important. It's up there. I don't know if it's the most important thing to understand when you're first getting into Nietzsche. I think it is one of the ideas that sort of comes later, or the understanding of it, or the insight comes later. But nevertheless, I think there are aspects of it that help to disclose the deep logic of what Nietzsche is doing. Is it something that he just mentions briefly in Zarathustra? Well, it's not really briefly. I mean, so many of the sayings of Zarathustra, so many of his discourses involve, even on topics other than the Overman and the Last Man, he will use the Overman as an anchoring idea. I mean, what comes to mind right off the bat is, when he's discussing friendship, let your friend be a longing for the Overman. There are many passages concerning the eternal recurrence in which the Overman becomes a key part, if not explicitly mentioned by allegory and by image. Now you ask, is his work dedicated purely to communicating insight, or is he trying to build a project here? Well, to be honest, I'm not sure if you can really have one without the other, because if you engage in a philosophical project, presumably, or hopefully, there will be insights that comprise that project, and unless you just keep your insights to yourself, if you go and write your insights into a book, well, that's necessarily undertaking a project. But given the latter half of your question, I think I see what you're getting at here, right, is that you've used Nietzsche to sort of clear away certainties or convictions that you may have held in the past, which you now recognize as revealing like what you call decadence values, or Nietzsche might also say exhaustion or nihilism or something that might have been at the basis of that. Sickness, essentially, right? And so after you clear away the sickness, do we really need to hold on to Nietzsche? Doesn't he say to abandon him? Doesn't Zarathustra tell his followers to abandon him and follow their own way? And, why should I take you so seriously, especially if everything you have said is true? And I like the way you put that. That's funny, because Nietzsche has been sort of taking shots at the windbags of truth and the dogmatists about truth. And you're right, if where, your sort of intuition is guiding you is into thinking, okay, there's a problem here if he's maybe building a philosophical system and I'm supposed to accept this as true. Isn't that in tension with what Nietzsche has been doing? I would say on that issue of how we're supposed to take Nietzsche's affirmative philosophical ideas, it's worth noting that he does present it, at least in Zarathustra, as an artistic work, that he is attempting to present his ideas in the form of lyricism and metaphor and stories and very poetic language, and he's using these sort of the symbolism that could be interpreted many different ways, and he does attempt to convey values here, but he does so through a work of art. And I think Nietzsche would say that most religions have done this, that this is how religions tend to teach. And this is how, he has his whole faith in music and his love of music, his desire to write musically, his desire to harness the power of music. He perceives the power of music from the very beginning of his career, and he wants to import that into philosophy. And so there's this sense in which art is the real playing field in terms of the valuation, right? There are some great lines in The Will to Power and in Twilight of Idols where he talks about how all the legislators of value felt that they had an absolute right to immorality in order to create a new morality. And he says also in Zarathustra that values are created. He wasn't given his values, he didn't find his values, they didn't descend from the lap of being. He had to fashion them for himself. And I think for Nietzsche, the legislator of values is far closer in type to the artist than he is to the pure idea of the philosopher or somebody like a religious thinker like a theologian. I mean, you might say that all of these elements are included, but that the artistic element is a very central piece that can't be lacking. So, I mean, do you have to take the values that Nietzsche tries to legislate in this artistic form and thus spoke Zarathustra, do you have to take those seriously and follow them dogmatically? Well, do you have to dogmatically follow the values that come through in Oscar Wilde's The Picture of Dorian Gray, or in Tolstoy's War and Peace, or in 2001 A Space Odyssey? I mean, I think Nietzsche is aware that what he is giving us is an artistic representation of the world out of his own perspective. He says this in the notes collected in Will to Power, where he talks about the world as will to power. Do you want to know what the world is to me? Shall I show it to you in my mirror? And so I think Nietzsche is aware of this, and there's something about conveying his ideas artistically, conveying his image of the world, his image of life. In this work, thus spoke Zarathustra, where, as you point out, the Overman appears sort of most frequently, or is the biggest. That's the work where it's a key part of the work, right? More so than any other book that Nietzsche writes. There's something about doing that I'm not trying to say don't take what Nietzsche is saying seriously, right? But what I'm trying to say is that conveying what he's saying artistically, in a way, might be an attempt to do something perhaps more serious than a philosophical, rational persuasion or explication of the idea of the Overman. Because, as he says, he's trying to write in blood. He's trying to be learned by heart. He's trying to find his way into the heart. He's trying to seduce. He's trying to tempt. And this comes with, in the text, him sort of speaking to his free spirits, hey, I'm seducing you. Hey, you have your own choice in the matter. You need to figure things out for yourself. Don't just dogmatically follow what I say. That would be pathetic. But yes, this is what I'm doing because that's ultimately where the action is. That's where the contestation of values happens, is on the level of art, which is pre-rational, sort of speaks to the intuition, speaks to the heart, sort of communicates on the level of sentiment. Now, as for the philosophical function that the Overman provides, I mean, to me, it's rather simple. I mean, as Nietzsche says, only the ocean could absorb a poisoned river, and man is the poisoned river, and the Overman is the ocean. Let us all flow out into the Overman. So, like the river, life is always moving. What is it moving towards? Well, he gives us at least two. He gives us a fork in the river, the Overman or the last man. Essentially, are we going to follow these gregarious values, the values established on this faith in the opposition of values, based on Platonism, the denial of the world of appearance, the elevation of the intelligible world or the world of ideas, the logos above that, calling that all eternal and fixed. That's real because it's eternal and fixed, whereas our world is changeable. Are we going to follow that and try to preserve ourselves and essentially become last men, essentially become the nihilists of nihilists on earth? Or do we move in the other direction? Do we try to overcome that? Do we now have a unique opportunity to fulfill nature's task? And that's not because Nietzsche believes that nature has a task, like in and of itself. Nature is blind impulse. But we are also part of nature. Consciousness is an aspect of nature. And through consciousness, we have the potential, we have the possibility to consciously determine the values that will guide the future of humanity, right? In fact, just going along with the last man values, moving in that direction, is sort of which you might say Nietzsche thinks is the norm for most species. Just blindly fulfill impulse, preserve the herd of organisms, and they all become instrumentalized and mediocre. But that is necessarily a path of degeneration, and it's a path of sickness. And, you might say, well, how can Nietzsche sort of judge and condemn humanity as it is and say that the direction it's currently going is bad, quote unquote? Well, it's funny because the very sickness that afflicts us is this faith in opposite values, particularly as it comes out in the moralizing of the world, in good and evil. The reason why Zarathustra calls humanity the skin disease of the earth is because we're the animal of resentment and bad conscience in the ascetic ideal. Essentially the animal that calls life bad, right? That consciousness as it currently exists, human consciousness as it has naturally developed, has made us into nihilists. It is inclining towards nihilism precisely because we've devalued the world, precisely because we've judged and condemned this world of appearance as bad compared to this fixed ideal of the good or God or any number of other things. And so man is the poisoned river because man is the animal that calls life bad. Man is the animal that judges and condemns life. And that's the thing that Nietzsche wishes to overcome. The problem is morality, therefore we have to overcome morality, which, leads to that paradox again. Is it Nietzsche's moral position that morality is bad and it has to be overcome? I think that would just be getting caught up in words. So the Overman provides a sort of a faith that is possible, that it can be overcome, that we could proceed beyond nature's greatest obstacle and consciously determine what values should guide humanity and thereby recognize the sick values, recognize that in fact they're not values at all, because the moral values which have guided mankind, rooted in Platonism or in Christianity, Platonism for the people, are essentially values that devalue. So they're anti-values, right? I mean, if you wanted to, you could see Nietzsche as a supreme moralist who is saying, I've found the real moral code, the moral code based on health and sickness. That's the real truth. These opposite values based on, the disembodied good, the harmless man as the archetype of goodness, the other world as where the good resides. That's all false. I'm going to give you the real formula of goodness in my understanding of health and sickness. And, if you were to interpret Nietzsche that way, it would raise these issues that I think you're sort of grasping for. But again, I think that's why grounding all of this in an artistic project is very necessary for understanding it. Because, just like they say, there's no accounting for taste, right? These ideas either resonate with you or they don't. You either see that same insight of, man, as we are now, our consciousness is a sick thing. And what about the possibility for health? Don't we require, if not an image of health or an ideal of health, some sort of hope or faith in the movement toward health? And that's what I think the Overman represents. And either you resonate with that insight or you don't. I certainly don't think Nietzsche wanted us to dogmatically believe in the Overman and literally build temples to the Overman and create a new set of doctrines that become dogmas of, the Overman religion. That's certainly not true. But I think it is an important and even central aspect of his philosophy. It's in some way an attempt to sanction and justify life, and that is part and parcel with Nietzsche's entire project. So thank you very much for the question, Tanish. Jason Rivera asks, Hi, Keegan. Are you familiar with George Ivanovich Gurdjieff? And if so, do you think he is worthy of an episode? I recently came across his work and I'm listening to an audiobook published by one of his students. There's some Nietzsche vibes in his work, but it's mostly Eastern philosophy. You and your bandmates autographed a copy of Starmony for me and I greatly appreciate it. Wonderful. It's a wonderful work of art. I hope you guys make it out to the Boston area in the future. Cheers. Thank you, Jason, and I may yet make it to the Boston area by the end of the year, but I'll have more details on that soon because it might actually relate to the podcast, more so than to the band. I've been asked about Gurdjieff before. I feel like this is like the second or third time that this has come up, certainly the second time in a Q&A, and I only have a passing familiarity with Gurdjieff. I think the Nietzschean connection that people are drawing is the fourth way, right? It's like he has 3 ways of spiritual growth that man have developed over the millennia, and he's presenting a 4th way. And if I recall correctly, it's a way that's supposed to be more appropriate to the situation we're in, to the era, and to the way that modern people think. But unfortunately, Gurdjieff just really isn't in my wheelhouse, and he hasn't really been a focus for me. There does seem to be some interest. In fact, I mean, as I mentioned before, maybe in the comments to this Q&A, if you'd like Gurdjieff to go on the poll, please do, and we'll see what the general reaction of the patrons is, how many other people would like to hear me talk about Gurdjieff. And also, I would just say, guys, whenever people are asking me to cover an author that I haven't read, or, any kind of author, fiction writer, philosopher, anyone, it takes a long time for me to get to a point where I feel comfortable analyzing and talking about somebody's work on the podcast. It's one thing talking about like Western philosophy more broadly, which I've read at some time or another, I wouldn't even say most, but many of the Western philosophers. But I can't just like read a book once and then be like, okay, I can go out and teach this to people now, right? That would be irresponsible of me. And from what I understand, Gurdjieff's work is very difficult. So if that is the kind of thing that I do end up covering, it's going to take, months and months of time before I would feel comfortable really talking about it. And so I have to choose very carefully what it is that I want to spend my time learning and getting involved with. Because I could very easily find halfway through my studies of Gurdjieff that, I don't agree with this at all. I suppose I could still present his ideas. I have no problem with that. But I guess I just wanted to make all of that clear. I mean, I guess it's probably obvious to many of you, but, I can't just sort of pick something up and read it. Like, all of the stuff that I've been talking about with Eastern philosophy, I only feel comfortable talking about that because I've been interested in Eastern philosophy and have read those works for years and years now. I mean, I'd been reading Nietzsche for 15 years or so, maybe longer than that, before I even started the podcast. So that doesn't mean don't request things or don't ask me to cover things that you might think might be out of the norm or out of my wheelhouse, but just kind of, I just want to be upfront about the real life limitations and the amount of work and research that has to go into this. So I don't currently know enough about Gurdjieff. I am familiar with, the general idea of him, but I don't even know enough to say whether he's worthy of an episode, I'll put it like that. So maybe that would be my counter proposal to you, is maybe drop that in the comment that you would like to see Gurdjieff added to a poll. And thank you very much for supporting me as an artist, and hopefully I will make it to Boston this year. Again, more details about that as I become aware of them. Victor Stromberg asks, "What's up, Keegan? I once in an Alan Watts talk heard him frame Daoism as a tradition more fitting for old folks, and I tend to agree. Since you've mentioned that you have prior experience with Tao Buddhism, I assume you either mean Zen Buddhism or Daoism and Buddhism, but whatever. Considering it is close to the current topic at hand, do you agree with what Watts was saying? I'm thinking if this were to be counterposed with the way Nietzscheans at times are portrayed as angsty teens, do you think there's any merit to predicting your own or other people's spiritual, philosophical dispositions based on tangible factors such as age? I've been enjoying your dive into Eastern philosophy, by the way, if that wasn't noticeable. Looking forward to Hume. Cheers." Thank you, Victor. I know exactly the talk that you're speaking of with Alan Watts, and I believe what he says is that the Taoist is associated with a type in Chinese literature, and just like in the Chinese culture that they refer to as the old rogue. I don't know exactly what the term in Chinese would be, but certainly when you look at like the story of the 7 sages of the bamboo grove, look up the 7 sages, everybody, if you want to know what an old rogue is in the Chinese literature. I mean, the most fanciful stories are concerning the one Taoist master who would walk around with a jug of wine, and he had a servant following him with a shovel and had instructed the servant that wherever he dropped dead from drinking, just bury him right there on the spot. These were old guys who flouted convention, and they would drink themselves silly and take drugs. And, Ji Kong, he would scandalize people who showed up to his house because he'd be doing metallurgy in the yard or smithing. And you weren't supposed to do that as an aristocrat. That was servant's work to practice the crafts. But, or another one of the sages, reportedly some, Confucian officials showed up at his house and he's just walking around naked and they were all embarrassed. And he's basically saying, the whole world is my house and this house is my pants. What are you doing in my pants? Was the line. Something like that. Silly guys, right? And I mean, to be honest, I don't think you really need to go into the Chinese culture deeply to understand this. I think if you are aware of, I think this is like an archetype that exists probably cross-culturally with older men. You get to a certain point where you stop caring as much about your appearance or about how you're perceived. You just don't care anymore. And I think Watts is saying there's a connection to Daoism because the Taoist strand of philosophy recognizes that there's something in a strange way that's enlightened about that attitude. That when you are freed from caring so much about how you are perceived, what your social role is, right? What the conventions are, how you are supposed to appear to others, what the proper thing to do, the proper way to present yourself, that naturally with age as that sort of withers away, there's something very freeing about that. And if indeed philosophers like Zhuangzi should be seen as philosophers of liberation, there's something that is liberating about the natural disregard for just at least some of the etiquette and social conventions that comes to us as we become older, especially with older men. And as with a lot of Chinese philosophy, the other thing about the Seven Sages is that there's a political and social context to this. A lot of the reason why these figures sort of came to prominence and became famous, and indeed, the idea that there were ever all seven of these characters hanging out in the same bamboo grove is like a later sort of myth. These were just sort of seven figures, some of whom knew each other or were related or whose lives intersected, but that they sort of became mythicized. But the reason why that was, the myth of the seven sages of the bamboo grove was distilled out of Chinese history was because this was during the Jin dynasty, I believe. This is at the end of the Han period of, the first real empire of China. And, after the Jin, everything kind of falls apart. We go into the northern and southern dynasties. And then the northern dynasty fractures into 16 kingdoms, and it's just sort of chaotic until the Tang dynasty. But just like during the spring and autumn period, right? There's all this chaos around. It's kind of suicidal or just foolish to go hold office and try and change the world. And so you have these old rogues who are basically saying the best way to win is not to play, right? In these depraved times right now, in these chaotic times, it's the best thing for me to do is just go get drunk in my backyard. The modern equivalent today would be, I just want to grill. So is Alan Watts correct that association is there in Chinese culture? I think he is. Is it true that Taoism itself is more fitted for older people? There might be some element of truth to that. But you bring up the thing with, Nietzscheans are portrayed as angsty teens. Well, I think Nietzsche himself would have said that his philosophy aims at youth. There's a kind of youthful vigor that he wants to recapture. There's actually a really interesting passage in Zweig's book where he's talking about how Nietzsche temperamentally, in terms of the tenor of his ideas, the sentiments, in a way kind of ages in reverse. And you can check out that episode once I upload it, and you'll see in that part what he's talking about. But essentially, Nietzsche's final metamorphosis is the child. And he does a thing I don't really talk about in that episode with Zweig. Nietzsche often sort of characterizes metaphysical philosophy and otherworldism as like a symptom of old age. He talks about the logicizing Socratic world interpretation, the theoretical worldview and way of life that comes with Socrates, as catching on during the later Hellenistic period of Greek life, so during the old age of that culture. That's when essentially Platonism can take hold. And there is something about the arrogance of youth, the idea, we talk about when people are young, they think they're going to live forever. They take more risks because of this. They don't really have that concept of mortality, at least in the same way, because they haven't come to that same realization as Captain Picard does in Star Trek Generations, where he says, I've recently come to realize that there are fewer years ahead of me than there are behind. And that realization, I think it's I mean, it is true. It's a trend that as people get older, they do become more religious. And they either go back to the religious traditions in which they were raised, or they become more spiritual. They just sort of start entertaining these ideas of life after death, or some sort of meaning that justifies existence, that I think comes out of that recognition that the future for them no longer holds an abundance of life. And here I mean life, real life, physiological life, embodied life, life in the world of appearances. They realize, again, there's more behind them than there is ahead. And that's when you start to entertain what Nietzsche said, what he called fleshless fantasies, right? Now, is that necessarily true that all people who are in old age are going to become metaphysical, more religious, more otherworldly? Well, not necessarily. I mean, we just talked about how Zweig says Nietzsche seems to go the opposite direction. So that's at least possible. And in the first episode on the Demonic series, we talked about Jacobi, who as a young boy was melancholy and brooding over religious matters. So there are some of us who are old even in our youth. So I wouldn't take these as like absolute statements. They're just sort of observations of a certain trend or a certain type of person that might be more common at certain periods of life. And there is, I mean, there's a reason why angsty teenagers do gravitate towards Nietzsche and not some other philosopher, because he is a philosopher that appeals to youth, that celebrates youth, that sort of gives an apologia for youth and for youthful risk-taking and living dangerously and caution to the wind, devil may care, right? Nietzsche's in favor of all of that, and he thinks, in a way he would say recapturing that youthful feeling is the path to eternal liveliness, which is the real goal, not eternal life. Now, does this mean you should go around and judge people based on their age, the kinds of what their spiritual disposition is, what their philosophical disposition is? On as you say, you should like judge them based on their age. I mean, why would you need to do that? I mean, the best way to figure out what someone knows or how someone feels or what they believe is just to have a conversation with them. So I would recommend doing that rather than judging people based on their age or their appearance or any number of these other factors. It's more, the idea that as you become older, you are going to be more prone to metaphysical flights of fancy, as Nietzsche might put it. That's an important insight, not because it gives us like a hermeneutic or like a heuristic for judging other people. Rather, it's useful for ourselves, right? For understanding what the temptations will be as we approach old age. Remember what Nietzsche says, that the way in which he talks about metaphysics as a temptation. Like he reverses the ordinary moral language, right? Where the ordinary moral language would be that living for the kingdom of heaven, living for the good, for virtue, living for all of these intangible, abstract ideas, that is the good thing to do in life. That's the fulfilling road, the right road. And it's a temptation away from that right road if you follow your desires or your impulses, right? Nietzsche sort of flips it in reverse and says, you should be throwing yourself into the world wholeheartedly, following your desires, even perishing, pursuing your conception of greatness or what it is you want most out of life. And don't be tempted by these metaphysical, tricks or something like that. So there is a very young orientation to Nietzsche's philosophy, but I think the point of that is to conjure youth in us as we get older, to allow us to stave off exhaustion and old age as long as possible in terms of our sentiments and in terms of our temperament. And this is why, by the way, the angsty teenagers probably don't get Nietzsche, because they don't really need Nietzsche, right? Nietzsche, can sort of exacerbate the, hormonal, like superheated feelings that they already have. And they can get, they can go too far in a few places and excessively focus on certain things in his philosophy that particularly appeal to them. But I think Nietzsche, there's a reason why people really have a different experience with Nietzsche when they read him in their 30s or in their 40s or even older than that, because he can make you fall in love with the world again and feel young again. And that's when you need Nietzsche, which is a very interesting kind of funny thing. And so too with the Taoists, as I recall, Alan Watts says that, well, of course you can study the Tao when you're very young, but the whole point is that of bringing up why it might be a better way of life for older people is because Taoism is a way of life of non-ado, of non-action. And so, I guess the worry would be that people who are in the prime of their life, when they should be active and out living and experiencing, might adopt this wu-wei ideology and become passive at the inappropriate time or something like that. And really that, the Taoism is very good for people to explore when, as Watts says, they've already contributed to society, they've played their role in society, they've raised children, they've done, all of the normal things in life, and then now in your twilight years, it's time to sort of, as Watts says, figure out what it's all about, something like that. And but I would say, I might flip Watts's insight on its head, that maybe the young people need some wu-wei because they're already going to be active and aggressive and ambitious and all of these things that might happen in youth or might characterize the temperaments of youth. And Taoism might be a window or a pathway into a little bit of that older wisdom, and possessing some of that older wisdom when you're in a time of your youth, of realizing, hey, sometimes the best move is to sit back and wait. Sometimes you don't need to force it. You don't need to micromanage. You set things in their proper order, and then it happens spontaneously. And seeing all of those little insights could be very helpful, even for attaining, the goals they might have in youth of going and chasing down a career and getting married and accomplishing things, right? The Taoist ideology or way of life can be very useful even for accomplishing things in this way. So that would be my answer to that. There is something to what Watts is saying, but you shouldn't take any of these as absolute statements. You can look at it both ways. But thank you, Victor, for your question. Okay, next we have Adam Seed. I really hope I'm pronouncing your name right. He says, "Hi, Keegan. Love your work, mate. I just wanted to ask if there were aspects of Nietzsche's philosophy that you personally don't agree with or otherwise aren't a fan of. Apologies if you have already covered this in past Q&As. Well, indeed I have. This is actually a very common question that I receive about Nietzsche because, I think because I spend so much time explicating Nietzsche's ideas and analyzing them, people want to see, where I am distinguished from Nietzsche. I think there's something like underneath this. Not saying you are, but a lot of people want to ask because they want to, in a way, make sure. They want to probe and test. You're not just a complete Nietzschean disciple, are you? You're not just, one of those people who takes Nietzsche dogmatically. Surely you have some disagreements with him. And again, I'll start out with the straight answer or the direct answer. I've brought up many things in the past that I do disagree with in terms of my politics is not Nietzsche's politics. I think some of the ways that he looks at health and sickness are a reflection of Nietzsche more than they are an insight into the world or something like that. And I think some of the ways in which he metaphysically, he goes so far into his anti-metaphysics that he denies cause and effect and things of this nature. I understand the argument, but I don't personally operate that way, right? It's almost like, I don't want to get too deeply into the weeds on this, but I think it is important to understand the broader point that Nietzsche's making when he's saying line, form, body, substance, cause and effect, ego, the will, all of these things are fundamentally errors, or that they're simply, it's not permitted to speak of them as truths, because the reason why we do is because they're indispensable for us. We can't conceive of the world. We can't cognize the world without these things. They are seen as necessary for us, not just for perception and cognition, but even owing to their regulative importance, right? The moral regulations they provide or make possible. And so I would agree with him on that account, that they are not objective truths, or that just because we can't think of the world without them does not make them true. And Nietzsche himself, I guess the next point would say, but I don't have a choice but to use cause and effect in how I understand the world. And Nietzsche might say, well, I agree that what he's doing is rolling the intelligible world into the world of appearances, right? So Platonism makes that division where there's the intelligible set above the appearance. Nietzsche says it's all appearance, right? So even the intelligible world, that's a world created out of our impulses. It's not this eternal fixed world. It's something that is changeable according to the evaluative judgments made by our drives. So is it illusory? Well, yeah, but it's no more illusory than the phenomenal world is illusory, and Nietzsche certainly doesn't want to deny the phenomenal world, deny the world of appearance. He wants to simply affirm that world as what is. And thus, in a strange way, in an almost paradoxical way, we end up affirming cause and effect, not because it's an objective fact, but because it's part of the way the world appears to us. So I understand all that of what Nietzsche is doing there, but it's almost one of those things where, okay, we're back at square one then, right? With a lot of these concepts. Like, okay, they're all false, but they're true, quote unquote, because the value for life ultimately decides, and therefore they're part of the world of appearances. And so we affirm them anyway. And I just don't see where we've gotten from there. And, maybe that was never his intention to center a denial of those things in his philosophy. It's just sort of a necessity based on the positions he's taken. But I'm almost left in the unenviable position of saying that the Zen masters said it better, right? That even all of that writing that spilled ink towards this issue of metaphysics, anti-metaphysics, and all of the intricacies therein is just sort of it would have been better to not say anything at all. It's funny I'm saying that because I'm essentially teaching a course on many of these issues right now because, I wanted to understand it, and I have a deep fascination with the problem of knowledge, right? And so the way that Nietzsche squares the circle of denying truth, but then also making claims that he thinks are quote unquote true, and he has a new evaluation of what true means, and this relationship between the appearance and the truth, that all fascinates me. But I recognize it for what it is, right? It's intellectual play. It is just simply a more rarefied form of entertainment, a more complex form of entertainment. It's not really, it's certainly, I don't think, is invigorating or life-promoting in like the Dionysian vitalist Nietzschean sense. It's definitely a sort of getting lost in sort of a mental world, right? And that's, I guess, that's part of why I think some of what Nietzsche says about sickness and health, and some of what he says about philosophy and consciousness and the intellect versus the instincts and the drives and the emotions is a bit suspect to me, because a lot of it is a contradiction in terms, something like that. But even this doesn't really get to the heart of sort of how I deal with my disagreements with Nietzsche, because, and it's very hard to explain how I feel about this, but I'm going to attempt to do so off the cuff. I think that when you know a thinker as deeply as Nietzsche, right, it's not really a matter for me of going through like an itemized list of like agreement or disagreement. I understand, like, even the things he says that I don't practically agree with, or that I don't, I wouldn't follow him all the way there. I understand why he says them according to like the logic that he's operating from. I understand, and it's not, I would agree at the end of the day, it's not systematic, because Nietzsche doesn't start from, axioms and proceed along these syllogistic chains where everything's linked to everything else. But he's a human being. He's a personality. He has a certain way that he thinks. And once you like crack into, you understand the way that Nietzsche thinks, I understand even why he believes the things that I wouldn't agree with, if that makes sense. And on the other side of that coin, because I am a perspectivist following Nietzsche, because I am an uber-modernist, somebody who wishes to overcome the modernist theory of truth, and I do see the way in which thinking and willing are the same, or they are inseparable from one another, and how values are always a part of thought, that leads me to a place where even when I agree with Nietzsche, I don't really quote unquote agree with him in the same way that someone does when they're rationally assenting to a philosophical idea that they think has been proved to them or something like that. or when they're saying, oh, I agree with this because it just aligns with my existing feelings or my prejudices. I'm actually very suspicious of things that I read that happen to align with my feelings and my prejudices. And I know that whenever something seems rationally obvious to me, there's some sort of value judgment that's being made that is coloring the way I see it. So I don't really, even when I disagree with Nietzsche, it doesn't really bother me because I understand the way he thinks. And because I know that it's the way that Nietzsche thinks, even when he says things that I agree with, I don't feel like he's not a god. He doesn't have an immaculate perspective any more than anyone else does. He has a very powerful perspective. He has a brilliant intellect. He has a great insight into humanity, into history, into the genealogy of our values and all of these things. But at the end of the day, it's not really important. I don't really think about things in this way, like itemizing where Nietzsche's right and wrong, where I agree and disagree. To me, it's really important to understand him as like a total personality, and then I counterpose Nietzsche with other personalities that also live in my head, that I've also discovered through old books, which are really just different impulses inside of me, right? And I contrast them together and think about, what would Nietzsche say about this? What would Descartes say about this? What would Spinoza say about this? What would Jacobi say about this? What would Socrates say about this? What would Heraclitus say about this? That is more interesting to me, trying to understand what judgments they would make and why, and then I try to reserve my own judgment, in a sense, up until the point in which a judgment has to be made, right? And that's the thing about a lot of these philosophical ideas. Very rarely does a judgment have to be made. It's why philosophy isn't really a science, right? Because the rubber hits the road moment, the experimental moment, the true test of whether an idea is right or wrong, oftentimes in philosophy it never comes. So what we're left with is just people following their own sentiments and their own prejudices a lot of the time. And that, I'm not excluded from that, and certainly Nietzsche's not, and certainly you are not, and anyone listening to this. So I just see things in a different way, and it kind of, it's hard to explain. I'm sure that some listening to this will just get immediately what I'm saying, like intuitively, and others are listening to this probably like wondering, like, what the hell is he rambling about here? But hopefully I've at least made my meaning like somewhat clear. So thank you for that, Adam Sied. I have been asked this before, but I will answer it again because it's a popular question. So thank you for that, and we will move on. Ernesto asks, hi Keegan, thank you so much for hard work and excellent execution behind each episode you upload. Now my question, Lou Salome had a profound intellectual friendship with Nietzsche before his mental collapse and a decades-long correspondence with Freud. If we see her as a crucial intellectual node, how do you think her first-hand understanding of Nietzsche's person and unpublished thoughts might have influenced Freud's reception or rejection of Nietzsche's ideas? And conversely, did her later Freudian framework change how she retrospectively interpreted her time with Nietzsche? Cheers. Thank you, Ernesto. Well, first I would say that the book that she wrote about Nietzsche comes out really before she has this relationship with Freud, or this friendship with Freud. It came out when Nietzsche was still alive, as a matter of fact. Now, did she later change her position on Nietzsche? I don't really know. I don't know enough about Lou Salome to know like the differences in the eras of her thought, but she retrospectively was interpreting her time with Nietzsche before I think she had any like serious engagement with Freud. And as far as her influence on Freud, I don't really know. I must confess my ignorance there of like to what extent Freud was influenced by her, or to what extent Nietzsche's ideas came to Freud through Salome. It wouldn't surprise me. And by the way, just to give a little background to those of you who may not have listened to this episode, I did an episode talking about Freud and sort of some of his key ideas, and showing some of the areas where I thought there was a clear Nietzsche influence, definitely a Schopenhauer influence as well, and talking about how Freud initially was very open about his inspiration from Nietzsche. He quotes from Nietzsche quite extensively in his first publication in 1899. And, later on, he would sort of, I don't think he said, I never read Nietzsche, but he would feign ignorance of certain things. I mean, the key incident, I believe, is when he and Adler and a few psychoanalysts in their book club would, analyze philosophical works and various things. And they were going through genealogy of morals. And I believe Adler said to Freud, many of these ideas seem very similar to things that you've said, Sigmund. And he said, well, I've never read this book by Nietzsche. I was totally unfamiliar with it. Now, is that true? Well, maybe it is. I mean, his first work just concerns the interpretation of dreams, and he mostly just quotes from Nietzsche's work regarding dreams. Maybe he hadn't really done an in-depth study of many of Nietzsche's ideas. But like, Carl Jung, who was much, much more open about how much he was influenced by Nietzsche, Freud and many of the other psychoanalysts tended to be somewhat dismissive of Nietzsche and tended to, I think, sort of downplay his insights in lieu of, looking at his pathologies, we might say, which, fair enough. But at least in Freud's case, it's very clear to me that Nietzsche's ideas of the unconscious and of drive and of sublimation, if Freud was familiar with them at all, he had to have recognized the similarity to his own psychoanalytic ideas. And either he was influenced by Nietzsche or he would have to recognize Nietzsche as a precursor. And I've always gotten the sense, this is just sort of like a vibes thing, guys, but I just don't think Freud paid Nietzsche the proper respect, right? Either way, if he had been actually influenced and tried to conceal this or tried to downplay it later, or if he actually genuinely was not that influenced by Nietzsche, he just had some early exposure and then happened to a lot of the same ideas, well, he still should have been a little more respectful that this philosopher, he came to many of the same conclusions I did just through philosophy. Wow, that's really impressive. Instead, he was always kind of like dismissive and trying to distance himself and downplay Nietzsche. Maybe that had something to do with the time as well. I mean, Freud was Jewish. He was, World War II was going on towards the end of his life. And Nietzsche had been sort of tarred and feathered as the philosopher of romantic militarism, the German philosopher of war and warriors, an obvious connection to the Third Reich and things like that. And, many people spent many years trying to rehabilitate Nietzsche from that and point out how the Nazis misappropriated him. But in the first half of the 20th century, that hadn't really happened yet. So maybe that's why, Freud was living in England. The Anglo world in particular was hostile towards Nietzsche. So there are just all these factors at play. But ultimately, I think Freud did not pay Nietzsche the proper respect. And the fact that he did try to downplay and kind of, if not outright conceal or lie, like just push away that he had been influenced by Nietzsche. But I don't think Salome really played a role in this because she didn't meet Freud until 1911. And so her book comes out before she meets Freud, and Freud's book that tarries most heavily with Nietzsche comes out before he meets Salome. But this isn't to say that there isn't something like directionally correct in what you're suggesting here, that Lou Salome is an intellectual node, and that she knew Nietzsche personally. She did, in spite of some of the ways in which she didn't fully follow Nietzsche's ideas and thought he might have, again, that line I always like to quote. It's actually George Lucas in episode 1, The Phantom Menace, where he says, I think I've gone too far in a few places, right? She certainly thought Nietzsche went too far in a few places. But she was definitely incorporated many of Nietzsche's key insights. There was a reason why they were so close philosophically, and they weren't just friends. There wasn't just, maybe there was a unrequited romance or whatever, but there was a philosophical, intellectual connection. So certainly, I think she did carry on Nietzsche's insights and probably did sort of even maybe unconsciously pass along his ideas into other thinkers that she knew. Another one besides Freud might be Rilke. There's definitely parallels between Nietzsche and Rilke, and the fact that Salome knew both of them, that's certainly interesting. But, Ernesto, the long and short of it is, I don't know. But I just think the dates of when they meet, and then when Freud's work that most heavily deals with Nietzsche, and when Salome's book on Nietzsche comes out, the dates don't really line up for either one of them sort of being a node for the other one understanding Nietzsche or establishing their relationship to Nietzsche's work. I think they both I think Freud probably read Nietzsche independently and took some influence and tried to play it off. And Salome obviously knew Nietzsche and wrote her book about him before knowing Freud. Short answer is I don't know. The long answer is, I don't think the dates really work out. But that, at the end of the day, Salome is, I think that's an interesting way to put it, a crucial intellectual node. I might steal that from you. No, but in all seriousness, thank you, Ernesto, for your question. Next, we have a short question from A. Foss. Are there any developments about the possible Athens trip to the Nietzsche conference that was discussed with the Will to Joy podcast? Well, yes and no. And this actually relates to an earlier question about me visiting Boston. Apparently, the American Nietzschean Society is meeting in Boston this year, and it might be more feasible for me to attend there. Of course, this all hinges on whether they accept my abstract, guys. And so I have written it. I am revising it. I plan to send it soon. And then, we'll see. Maybe it is the kind of thing where I might try to attend both, but it might make more sense for me to just attend the one in America, especially given that in the latter half of the year, I'm trying to get back into touring with the band. I'm in a period now where I'm working very heavily on the podcast, and I'm being very productive in the philosophical direction, but the second half of the year, I kind of have to, just by necessity, switch back to the band. And there might be an opportunity for me to go on tour with the band and hit at least 2 philosophical events while I'm doing that. And that's almost too good of just a life experience to pass up. So that's kind of what I'm planning. I don't want to say too much more because I don't want to give too many more details of I don't know how many of these details are really public about the Nietzschean conference and where they're holding it and who's attending and everything. So I don't really know. But there are things going on behind the scenes, and I will let everyone know exactly what I end up doing as soon as I know exactly what I'm going to end up doing. But thank you for that question. Thank you very much. Mitchell DeSimple says, have you ever considered doing a revised and succinct series of your podcast? I'm thinking where you take a lot of your old episodes and revive them, considering that they go over a lot more of the common topics and questions that your viewers would have. Much like you do with the readings of Nietzsche's actual text, I would imagine that creating a new series that goes over those heavy-hitting topics in a more succinct manner could crop up views. Especially considering the longer format, I would wonder whether a revamp of old episodes would be of interest. I should clarify, when you do the readings of some of Nietzsche's texts, one can't avoid directly engaging in subject matter that your topical videos may miss, either by their sheer length or by not needing to adhere to the quotes as much. 20 minutes about. Thank you, Mitchell. Yeah, I've done this a little bit. I did some short form videos on master and slave morality, or some of the things in the Ubermodernism series, the one on Nietzsche and his view of truth and his critique of how we normally think about truthfulness. I've done this a little bit. I also went and I revamped the 4th episode on Nietzsche's headstone that he buys for his deceased father. But I have thought about this, doing something structured maybe a little bit more the way that you suggest. I was actually, before I got brought on to teach the course at Acid Horizon, I was kind of toying with the idea of arranging something in the format of a course, of a total introduction to Nietzsche, covering all his main ideas. Granted, the idea wasn't to do short form. It was more like an hour each and cover each of the big ideas of Nietzsche in a really comprehensive and succinct manner. But maybe it would be a better idea. As he says, it would definitely attract more views if I did these as shorter form videos, like little explainers in the main topics of Nietzsche's philosophy. That does tend to get more views than the long form podcast. On the other hand, the podcast has always been my main focus of the long form content. I think is really the best way to engage with philosophy, because there are so many nuances and twists and turns and so many details and things that get left out when you do these sort of short form. You always end up glossing over things. Granted, that is going to be more popular, that is going to get more eyeballs. I'm trying really not to produce content according to that logic. I don't want to be even calling it content like I just did. It is content, that is the correct word for it, but I'm trying not to get into that content creator mindset of like, what's going to be really popular. So I actively fight against that in myself. I think though that what you're pointing out are like the utility of doing something like this, the resource that it would provide to have a library of like succinct explanations of core concepts of Nietzsche would be very useful. I don't know if I'm going to do it as like a devoted project where, okay, I'm going to churn out all of these explainers. It's probably going to continue to be something where every once in a while I will continue to put out short form videos. And yeah, it probably would be a good idea to go and revamp and revise and do some succinct episodes of the podcast. So it is on the table, Mitchell. I just don't know where that's going to fit into everything because I have so much to do in the long form content sort of sphere, right? I have so much more that I want to talk about beyond Nietzsche as well. But it's definitely going to happen. I'll say that. I will say definitively that I will continue to produce some revised and succinct episodes on, core concepts. I just can't say when and at what pace. That's what I'll say. So thank you for that. It's a great idea, and it's already been sort of in my mind. I just don't know exactly how that's going to play out. Next, we have Filter Juice. They say, "Hi, Keegan, you absolute legend." Thank you. "I can't remember which episode you said this, but I seem to vaguely remember you mentioning that you were connected with Buddhist philosophy and perhaps meditation in the past, but you became disenchanted. Would you go into this a bit?" And this is actually another repeat question in a way. I've been in a lot of repeats in this one. Gurdjieff, where do you disagree with Nietzsche? And can you talk about your background with Buddhism? I've gotten all of these before in Q&As. Again, I'm happy to answer them again because presumably there's new people in the Patreon. There's people who haven't listened to the old Q&As. So, and of course I'm going to always answer the question differently according to how I'm feeling at the moment and which force is seizing me at the moment. So, it is worthwhile, and I can see why this would be interesting to many people. There was a time when I would have described myself as a Buddhist. Now, specifically, I was into Zen Buddhism, which is kind of like its own thing. It's very different from the rest of Buddhism. But broadly speaking, I would have described myself as a Zen Buddhist, and I did explore Theravada Buddhism and other branches of Buddhism. I don't know if I would necessarily say I became disenchanted. It was more that I went looking for something in Buddhism that I ultimately came to believe is not something that I needed, that I needed to practice some sort of religious tradition in order to find. I mean, I've been diving a lot more into Spinoza recently, and there's actually going to be an episode on Spinoza coming up soon, a second episode on Spinoza. And there are those who have described what Spinoza is doing as a form of European Buddhism or Western Buddhism, insofar as Spinoza sees everything as you could kind of come to some inkling of dependent origination from Spinoza, and he's also attuned to the question of ending suffering, and specifically, and he sees the remedy in a similar light to the Buddhists, right? In that he sees the remedy to our suffering in changing, first and foremost, our view, our mindset. Where he differs from the Buddhists is then there's a whole practice. You have to apply your will, and ultimately it's not an intellectual salvation that comes in Buddhism, and at least in Theravada Buddhism, and I would argue in Zen, it's not something that comes from outside either. It's not, in Mahayana Buddhism, there's this whole idea of you can sort of, I don't want to say pray, but you can honor the bodhisattvas and call on their help, and even in Pure Land Buddhism, there's even the idea that you could be reincarnated into another realm in which you will get enlightenment by calling on the name of the bodhisattva. So it's like a salvific religion where other power is doing the work. I understand why that sort of religion, that take on the Buddhist religion emerges. I think there are certain things certain human thought patterns that will produce, like you're always going to have a split in religions between the icon and the iconoclast, or between being saved by grace or by works, to use some like Western terminology, right? And so am I saved by my own power or by the power of something else? Am I saved by doing good karmic deeds, or is it something that has to do with a realization? There's always like dichotomies that emerge, because there's like different ways of looking at the truth and different psychological temperaments approaching the religion and all of these things. So I understand why that's there, but I think the Buddha himself, I think Siddhartha Gautama, Shakyamuni Buddha, would probably, I think he would say that Pure Land might be missing the point, and that's probably a very extreme thing for me to say, or a very forward thing for me to say, given that I'm no longer consider myself part of the Buddhist community, and that I'm a Westerner. I don't come from a Buddhist tradition in my family or in my country, so who am I to really make a determination like that? But it's just the sense I get that, Buddha, his last words are, work out your own salvation with diligence. It's very much a focus on, this is a practice that you have to do, and that it is within your power to end your own suffering. And indeed, you can go and help others along the way, but that ultimately the buck stops with you. And I think that whole attitude comes through in Zen to some degree too, that like there's no help for you. This all, you're the only thing, right, that is standing between you and liberation. The reason why I say Spinoza kind of differs with that is because he says that essentially attaining what Buddhists would call the right view, right? Attaining a certain perception of the truth, attaining to a certain intellectual understanding, the intellectual love of God, that in itself is a kind of salvation. And there's a similar logic as to how, right? You're detaching from the fruits of your actions, from the karma created by your actions in a way. You're withholding from being hopeful or fearful, which is in a way releasing your desires. You're sort of leaving it all up into the hands of God, but not in a way of saying an other power beyond myself is going to save me, more in the sense of just sort of saying everything's in God's hands, everything that happens is going to happen, and I release my desire for a certain outcome. I release my desire for the consequences. I'm no longer going to live according to the sad passions of hope and fear, not because of a practice or a will, but because I now have this understanding that shows me that that these things are simply going to lead me to more sadness, going to lead me to more suffering. And because of this attitude, many people have compared Spinoza to the Stoics, sort of reason mastering the passions and all of these things, managing your expectations and all of this. I remember when I talked to Dr. Gregory Sadler, he made the point that he thought Spinoza was far more extreme than the Stoics in many ways. But that's neither here nor there. The reason why I bring up Spinoza in the first place is because I feel like what I was really looking for in Buddhism was something like what Spinoza is trying to do, the kind of thing that you could get out of Spinoza. And what I mean by that is Spinoza wants to attain a sort of blessedness of mind. He wants to show us how to, live in that intellectual love of God, and, not God as a personified being, but God as all nature, of which we are all a part, and which is not separate from us in any way, and therefore to be freed from the mental suffering that we impose on ourselves, and to therefore attain to that kind of philosophical transcendence of, like the way Socrates transcends the fear of death, or, any number of things. That it's sort of like the power to be at home in the world, and to sort of, even if everything's not okay, to realize that everything's okay, if that makes sense. I mean, essentially, I was just, I was in my youth, I was in my early to mid-20s, I was going through an existential crisis in some sense. I had never really had, like, a religious framework. Christianity has never connected with me, and anytime I've tried to approach Christianity and the Christian God, I'm met with a sense of alterity, or just, it all seems very foreign to me. I mean, as I've brought up on the podcast recently, Christians, the incarnation is a central thing for Christianity. The fact that God incarnated in this specific human being and these specific events happened where he died and rose from the dead and is going to come back. And, I just never believed that. I could never bring myself to believe that. So even as people, I've read Christians over the years, Kierkegaard, Pascal, Chesterton, Lewis, who make very good arguments. And there's all sorts of rich philosophical history within Christianity. And some of it's very compelling, but it never resonated with me. It never rang true to me. I could never force myself to believe it or bring myself to believe it. And so I started looking elsewhere. I mean, this is all very typical. I don't think I'm very particularly special or odd or unique in, the moment I was going through in my life as a Westerner that was essentially raised in a secular culture. I was looking for some sort of spirituality that I could believe in, and I think a lot of why I gravitated towards Buddhism is because there is a practice. It is practical. It is, there's that great line where Buddha says to Sariputta, he asks Sariputta, "Do you believe this teaching that I've given you?" And he says, "No, I do not believe. And just upon hearing, I don't believe." And Buddha says that's very good. You shouldn't believe simply upon hearing. You should see, and the wise will know for themselves. So there's this, we have this sort of like celebration of faith and believing without having to see. In the story of Thomas having to touch Jesus's wounds, and then Jesus literally says, "It's good that you've believed after seeing, but it would be better if you believed without seeing." In Buddhism, it's the opposite. It's like, okay, well, if you just hear what I say and believe, I guess that's good in some way because maybe you'll do the practice and cure yourself of your suffering. But it would probably be better if you saw and knew for yourself and believed on that basis, because then your belief will be much stronger. And so the sort of like, there's an empirical nature to Buddhism, a practical nature to it. It's very grounded in the problem of dealing with suffering, and not just pain or whatever, but again, the mental suffering that's layered on top of that, and the understanding that according to your attitude and maybe even a practice that you do of detaching from your desires, even things which might cause you great physical pain, you can in some way still be, if not okay with it, accepting of that suffering and not cause yourself to suffer additionally to it, and not let it lead to like existential fear or any of these other things, right? But a lot of it is based, again, on this empiricism. Like, to draw a comparison to Nietzsche and the way that he sort of experiments with himself, and he sees how he interrogates where thoughts come from. What is the instinct that's driving this thought? What is the impulse at the base of this thought? Is it a healthy impulse or a sick impulse? What does this thought signify? What is it a symptom of? What kind of thoughts do I have when I'm sitting still, when I'm morbid, when I'm sick, when I'm alone? What kind of thoughts do I have when I'm with people? What kind of thoughts do I have when I'm moving? What kind of thoughts do I have when I'm feeling joyous? All of these things, sort of the way that Nietzsche experimented with finding the right air pressure and altitude and humidity and all of these things, the right climate, recognizing the connection between inside and outside. That same empiricism exists in Buddhism. That's what meditation is, in a sense, of sitting down and taking stock, taking account of your thoughts. And part of the recognitions that will happen is that the thoughts don't come with a stamp of origin, that you don't have as much control over your thoughts as you think you have, if indeed you have any. And that many people would think, if I control anything, I control my thoughts, don't I? And I think the Buddhists would say no in a large sense. And that might be their problem with like Spinoza's intellectual love of God. Just get yourself to this intellectual understanding and then you won't suffer anymore. Well, that might sound very nice, but it might be that the morbid thoughts, the fearful thoughts, the thoughts that make you suffer arise anyway, in spite of your apparent understanding. But in any case, that's all what I was sort of like looking for in Buddhism, is the same thing that Spinoza was looking for, and he tries to get there by different means, attaining that blessedness of mind. And ultimately, it's not so much I became disenchanted with Buddhism, To the extent that I did become disenchanted, it was in realizing that there are certain things in the religion that depend on supernatural or metaphysical claims. The idea that there is sort of like samsaric rebirth, that it's not just that you die and then it's all over. Because if that's the case, if you die and it's just all over, Buddhist practice is not really as important as it would be if you have a chance of ending up in a hell realm, for sure. Or right, so even ending up as one of the in one of the heavens is probably not the best thing in Buddhism, right? They always say a human life is the most important, the most cherished thing, because humans have the ability to walk the middle way. The people in the heavens are too happy. They're so absorbed in pleasure, right? You're living in heaven. You're in constant state of bliss and pleasure. Why would you ever want to release yourself from your desires and attain liberation? You're not going to want to be liberated. And the people who are in the hells are suffering so much that they can't think straight. And the people, those who have been reincarnated as animals are too stupid, right? They don't have the intellectual capability. Only humans who are kind of right in the middle have the ability to walk the middle path and to seek liberation. So it's a very it's very beneficial to have a human birth. They say it's the rarest thing, right, to have a human birth. And so, but if you take away that whole samsaric wheel and many of the metaphysical claims, then it's just sort of like, well, regardless of how you feel about it, eventually you will die. And if we're just in a materialistic world and you die and your consciousness is snuffed out, then what's the problem? Some of the ways that you can translate nirvana would be cessation or extinction or extinguishment, right? Well, that's certainly the end of your life in a materialistic world is the extinguishment of your consciousness. And it is only within consciousness that we can that we can suffer from something. So we don't suffer from death, we suffer from the fear of death. And so, if you're going at it from a sort of, and I don't even want to say materialist because I'm not really a materialist. I'm agnostic towards the material world. I'll say as someone who affirms the world of appearances, someone who lives in the world as it appears to me and does not put any stock, any value in other worlds. Nietzsche has given me that language, which I'm very thankful for understanding this. As somebody who's oriented on this life, I would understand that what the Buddhists are trying to give you is a way of managing your emotional states while you're alive. It's for the benefit of living a better life, not being afflicted by what Spinoza would call the sad passions while you're in life. But it's not such an urgent thing because we would have to assume most people do not attain to that kind of blessedness of mind, and they die, and then it's just over, right? They get liberation in that moment from all of their suffering. And so it's not really a big problem or anything of any urgency. And without that sort of metaphysical grounding, Buddhism does just sort of become another, it is, the way I would look at it is just another life philosophy. That is its ultimate value to me at the end of the day. It is alongside the Stoics or Spinozism or Nietzscheanism or any number of other sort of religions, philosophies, ideologies, ways of life that help you live a better life in the here and now, and there are different strategies for doing this. I ultimately just found it wasn't the strategy for me. And I mean, a lot of that might have to do with the moral ideology of Buddhism. And, the moral ideology within the internal logic of Buddhism, especially Theravada, it all refers back to ending your suffering and ending the suffering of the beings around you. And so, their argument would be it's not just do the right, try to be compassionate and generous and selfless just because that's like some sort of abstract moral good or something like that. Like, no, this is actually actively ending your suffering by behaving in this way. But then that sort of brings us to the question of why is ending suffering the ultimate thing that I should be aimed at? And that's where Nietzsche is that was like a light switch moment for me, or a light bulb moment for me, of suffering is a part of life. Whether or not we evaluate life as good or bad, it can't be on the basis of suffering, because suffering is not an end, it's a means. Physiologically, it's a way of pushing the organism or pulling it in a given direction, just like pain and pleasure. They can't be the values on which we measure life. That's a category error, confusing the ends and the means. And so, the whole central premise of Buddhism, that your whole way of life and life philosophy should be oriented around ending suffering. I don't think that really pans out for me. And again, the reason being that I don't believe in the metaphysical, supernatural, otherworldly claims of Buddhism, because if I did believe in those things, then yeah, it would actually be rather important that I don't end up in a hell realm, or that I don't miss my chance with this human birth to liberate myself. But because I don't believe in any of that, and everything is sort of enclosed within the circle of the life I actually live, well, suffering is a part of that, and I have more of an attitude now that I am here to experience the whole panoply of possibilities for a human life, to whatever extent possible. And that without the suffering, without the dissatisfaction, without disappointments, without yearnings and desires, without tragedies, all of the pleasures in life wouldn't be there either. And so do we want to reduce all of the pain out of life and thereby also reduce all the pleasure and just have this sort of experience of indifference, of equanimity? Well, that seems like living as though you're already dead. I will be indifferent once I'm dead, right? That's more of my attitude now. It's like, and if I end up in a position where a tragedy or a cataclysm so horrible befalls me that I can't cope with it, I might wish in that moment that maybe I should have cultivated my Buddhist abilities more, so that I could detach from my desires in this moment. But I think again that's my Nietzscheanism comes out of, ultimately at the end of the day. This is so trite, but it comes out of the judgment, or I'll say the faith that life is good, life is innocent, that life is not to be condemned, it's not unjust. And so in this world, horrible things happen to people, all sorts of horrific ends that people meet, all sorts of horrible cataclysms and again, disappointments, tragedy, suffering. But that's part of the game. That's the price you have to pay. The question isn't, is life to be condemned on account of the suffering in it? Is it worth the price to live a life? Would you pay the price of the suffering that is required in order to experience the joys of being alive as a conscious being? And so, to those of you who've already heard me talk about this, I'm sure I've repeated some of the same themes, but again, hopefully I've given a satisfactory answer to Filter Juice. It's sort of, it's not like I ever had a moment where I was like, I'm repudiating this, Buddhism's a bunch of bullshit. It might be appropriate for many people, just as Christianity is appropriate for many people. I think it appeals to certain different things and personality types, like the real hardcore Buddhism of like Theravada or Zen or Thai forest Buddhism or something like that. I know there are more easygoing things like Pure Land that I've mentioned, but these are different strategies that appeal to different personality types. And ultimately, at the end of the day, I just found it's not for me because of the basic core intuitions that I have that are more congenial to Nietzsche's approach, or frankly Spinoza's for that matter. The thing I love the most about Spinoza probably is the fact that he says that the thing that we have to do is attain to a new level of intellectual understanding, because he doesn't believe in freedom of the will. So he's not saying like you have to work really hard or really desire or have the willpower to change something in the world so that you can be happy or fulfilled or live in the love of God or have blessedness of mind. He basically just says, if you acquire new information and you internalize it and you know it to be true, that will in and of itself relieve your mental suffering. And that makes sense to me in a really profound way, that ultimately, if you really believe something to be true, right, it's incontrovertibly true. You can't believe otherwise as an act of the will. Well, that is going to affect the way that you see the world and experience the world. And so it's actually by the increase of knowledge and understanding, not with this whole game of the will and forcing yourself through willpower or whatever, that the way that you attain a justification for life, or that you're able to live the good life, can be simply through the path of understanding. And so, yeah. And as regards meditation, I did a fair bit of meditation. Again, like with Buddhism, it's a certain strategy, it's a certain toolkit. It could be useful for many people who, might get stuck in certain tape loops of the mind, or that need to see for themselves the way in which their thoughts come without them asking or telling their thoughts to come. They come from, seemingly of their own accord. That might be very useful for people to see. I do think meditation can become a very culty behavior. I do think people can get sucked into it and see it as a panacea. And I think that also, if human beings needed to meditate, if there was, it's based on this whole idea of there's something wrong with your brain the way it is, and you need to go in and fix it with meditation. I'm not saying that that's how everyone sees it, but a lot of people get into that mindset. And again, I think, no, it's not that the human brain is fundamentally wrong. When people get angry at things, it's usually because there's a reason that they're angry, and who am I to say, you shouldn't be angry, you should be able to restrain that emotion at will. It's yeah, there are times when you need to be able to have that power to do that, but at other times it's sometimes it's appropriate. Throw yourself into anger, throw yourself into lust, right? These things that the Buddhists would say are all bad, and frankly most religions would say are all bad, are just normal parts of human life. And we want to regulate those away. I mean, Nietzsche would say because of the social utility of regulating those things, and that it's gotten a little out of hand since then. But, I think there's nothing fundamentally wrong with our emotions and with getting carried away by thoughts or emotions. And sometimes it's okay to throw yourself into those things. And I don't need to be going around feeling every time I'm I really desire this, I'm going to go get that I need to pull back from that and be I'm just causing myself suffering by desiring that. Okay, yeah, that's true in a really broad sense, but what's the point of life then? Right? Sure, I'm alive, but why? But okay, I'll stop rambling about Buddhism. Thank you very much, Filter Juice. Okay, next up we have Ian Savage. And he says, Keegan, I apologize as this is less of a question and more of a comment, but really it's an expression of gratitude for what you do here on the podcast. Thanks, man. In my free time, I'm a writer, and having been working on a project for, at this point, close to 20 years. However, it always felt incomplete. In college, during my undergrad, I always had a love for Nietzsche, but I didn't truly understand him, and still don't in some ways to this day. But after discovering your podcast, I was hooked. Importantly, after listening to your coverage of the birth of tragedy and the episodes on Greek tragedy specifically, I finally realized what my work was missing, the elements of Greek epic and tragedy. If it weren't for your podcast, I think my work would suffer and I wouldn't be where I am today without it. Again, thank you for what you do and how much work you put into your episodes/lectures. Regards, Ian. Thank you very much, man. I really appreciate hearing that, actually. It's stuff like this that really... I appreciate hearing the most. And he adds a P.S. As a brief request for episode material, I would of course love for you to get back to the Greeks, but also episodes book club of Daybreak and Zarathustra, Notes from Underground, the film Killing of a Sacred Deer, directed by Yorgos Lanthimos, and the 1997 anime adaptation of Berserk, and The Lawrence of Arabia, starring Peter O'Toole. Well, thanks, Ian. Notes from Underground is definitely a contender. Daybreak and Zarathustra, I mean, I would have to get to those eventually, right? And the Greeks, we've got a little something coming later this season from the Greek world. A couple things. And people keep asking me to do Berserk, so, one day. It's very hard for me to find the time to, watch a show, but... I suppose if it's for the podcast, I could check it out. And yeah, I also, it's been a long time since I've seen Lawrence of Arabia, but I remember really liking that movie when I was younger. And as I recall, that's Buzz Osborne's favorite movie, Buzz from the Melvins. Or at least it's his favorite one right now, the one I've heard him mention in interviews a couple times. So yeah, that's all possible. But I will surely get to notes from underground eventually, and definitely on the Greeks. That's kind of coming up in the more immediate future. But thank you, Ian. Thank you very much. Mustache Man says, "Hey Keegan, would you ever consider an in-person, especially Austin-based meetup or live event? I find tremendous value in the work you're doing, but often find real-world connections on these subjects rare. Would be great to participate in a local community around these topics. Thank you, Mustache Man." I suppose that's after Nietzsche himself, or maybe Super Mario. But to be serious, Mustache Man, I have thought about this in the past, and the only thing is that I don't really have any experience in setting up events like that. I mean, I'm sure if I really, put my mind to it, I could figure all of that out. But that's not something that's been at like the front of my priorities. That would be kind of cool, but to be honest, I'm not a great like leader or organizer of things. So there's that. That's not to say I might not participate in something like that. I mean, it would be really cool to have a sort of a community, a symposium community in Austin or something like that. So, I'm open to the idea. It's not something that I'm currently planning, and it would take a lot of planning. There would be logistics involved as to what are we meeting up to discuss? What is the format? What is the venue? Is there a screening process for who can attend, or is it just open to the public? All of these sorts of things. So, yeah, I don't know, but that's my honest answer. Okay, Noah Evans. He writes, "Firstly, I would like to know if you plan to return to Deleuze and maybe go more in depth in his work. While his philosophy is not the most faithful to Nietzsche's, it certainly seems faithful enough, while still moving beyond in manner of success. I don't think any other philosopher has yet managed. In my eyes, he's the most Nietzschean spirited philosopher since the man himself, and it feels like there is so much more between him and Nietzsche left untouched. Secondly, in your response to President Sunday, you presented a definition of fascism that, to my understanding, defined it as a process by which a people cling to a common identity, ? That they essentialize the identity, although I'm uncertain if there is a difference between essence and identity. If that is right, does the problem lie with identity itself or the severity by which people cling to it? As I see it, we are forced to identify with something to have an identity, even if, as a non-essentialist, I can agree that they are duplicitous. Is identity something to be overcome, then? Sorry if this is incoherent. I'm not as good at organizing my thoughts as you." Oh, that was fine. I understand. I think I understand pretty well what you're asking. Finally, favorite album of 25. This one's kind of like, I don't know, maybe some people would think this is like lowbrow because it's just kind of old school rock and roll type stuff. But I think my favorite album that came out last year was Witchrott's album Soul Cellar. That's Soul Cellar, Cellar. I just really love that album, and it's just good riffs, like good old-fashioned hooks and riffs. And I'm really into that style of vocals that she does. I could see some people being turned off by it, but if you've listened to any like sort of Scandinavian like retro rock or vest metal or bands like In Solitude or The Oath or anything like that, I think you would probably really dig this band. They're from Canada. So that would be my pick for favorite album of 25. But to return to your other questions, will I go back to Deleuze? Yes. Again, same thing though, like the caveat I gave earlier. A lot of you have to remember when you're sort of requesting something that's very labor intensive, I really have to commit to that, and it takes a lot of time. And I should say I actually might slightly disagree or quibble that his philosophy is not faithful to Nietzsche's. I think his interpretation of Nietzsche is actually fairly faithful. I mean, there are a couple of points that I've brought up, like mainly his interpretation of the eternal return, and just a couple other things that I think are not in the spirit of what Nietzsche actually argued. But I think overall the vision that he presents of Nietzsche, of his overall philosophy is fairly good. And here I'm really just speaking of what he says in Nietzsche and philosophy, not, every single remark he's ever made about Nietzsche in every place, ever. Just particularly in that book, I feel like he gives a really coherent, and fairly clear presentation of Nietzsche. And people say that Deleuze is hard to read, or that, he's just one of the most obscure philosophers, one of the most complex. And I would say, and that I know that's true from Anti-Oedipus, but I guess what I would say is, like, in Nietzsche and philosophy, where I'm already really familiar with the underlying ideas, that work was very, very easy for me to comprehend. And I think most of what he does is just to make clear several aspects about the way that Nietzsche thinks about things, and the fact that there is a logic to Nietzsche's thought. Not, again, a system, but there is a certain pattern of engagement with certain ideas or something like that. And I know, with rhizomatic, like schizoanalysis, in the grand scheme of things, Deleuze wouldn't say that Nietzsche has any sort of center to his ideas. But, I mean, he's able to at least present a coherent account, a very sober interpretation of Nietzsche. And I think to the degree that that work may appear mystifying, it's really just probably people who have that experience, it's just unfamiliarity with the subject matter. So then when you go out to Deleuze's broader corpus, I mean, the people that Deleuze is influenced by, Spinoza, Duns Scotus, Leibniz, you have to have a fairly decent command of ancient Greek philosophy and Enlightenment philosophy generally. There's just a lot of groundwork you have to lay, I think, before taking on Deleuze's broader philosophy, a lot of which I don't have a good command of. So I know it's just going to be... Oh, and Henri Bergson, that's another one that I don't really have a good enough command of. That's very important to Deleuze. So I just know it's going to be a big project, a big undertaking that's going to require a lot of legwork on my part. So, I've spoken before, I want to get back to Deleuze. I want to cover some of the Thousand Plateaus or Anti-Oedipus or even Difference and Repetition. It's going to be a big undertaking, so I can't exactly say when that's going to be. And to be perfectly honest, I mean, it probably won't be this season. I'll say that much. Second, you asked about the response to President Sunday. This video will eventually hit the public, and that response video has not been made public, so most people are probably not going to know what you're talking about. But it's not really important because you asked me about a specific question about how I was defining fascism in that video. And just like with Romanticism, fascism is a funny word. It means a lot of different things to many different people. And some people in modern times just use it as a term for authoritarian government. It could be applied, people will apply it to Xi Jinping or to Vladimir Putin or to Duterte in the Philippines. I remember a time on Fox News where they were throwing around the term Islamo-fascist instead of, Islamists or, Islamic militants. They were sort of toying propagandistically with whether or not they could bring in the fascist label for Islamic extremists. Now, is there actually any real content or meaning to this signifier? Is there actually a political meaning to it? I think there is. I mean, there are still ideological fascists. They're obviously still around. But I think trying to define the term by giving it definite ideological meaning would be a mistake because, for one, it's just simply not the way the term is used. And furthermore, the fascists themselves are not totally coherent. They don't all agree with one another. It even means different things to them. And I think ultimately it is more of a vibe or a certain set of, well, I'll get into what I really think it is in a moment, but, we could define it as a specifically right-wing political ideology, as most people, most leftists and indeed liberals would do. But, we can't ignore the ways in which even, especially in America, where we have a sort of a libertarian right and we have small government conservatives, how they have deployed the term fascism to use or to indicate some sort of government overreach or authoritarianism. And I think the people who talk about the post-war consensus, whatever their motives might be, they do have a point. They are onto something. Insofar as we We entered a new era of liberalism, a new consensus on liberalism in the Western world following World War II. And specifically in America, you could see FDR's reforms, or however you want to look at them, as a reconstitution of what America means as well. And within that zeitgeist, fascism is like the evil thing from the past. It was the demon we had to slay in order to establish this new order. And so when you call someone a fascist, you're really you're doing the same thing that the Christians might have done in the Middle Ages, to refer to somebody like as a pagan, like they're a throwback. They want to drag us back to an earlier, more barbaric time that belongs in the past, that we defeated and overcame, and in a way founded the current political order, the current social order, on the defeat of that old way of being. But for my part, I think we don't really do ourselves any favors when we try to understand this phenomenon through historical forms of it from the 20th century. I understand that it might be useful to make analogy to past regimes in order to illustrate a point. That might have great rhetorical force to say, this thing you're doing politically is just like what the fascists did. I understand why people do that. But the problem is we confuse that way of using the term with as if there's been this sort of coherent ideological tradition that goes back to Mussolini, and therefore by understanding like Mussolini and fascism and Italian corporatism, you can somehow understand what's going on in the current day. And I think that's where the analysis falls apart. Because to me, even though you can draw these historical parallels, the situation, it's always the differences in the situation that to me are the most interesting and often the most salient. It's the new developments in technology and social conditions that really present new challenges and delineate the territory of what the political debates are and, what's going on in politics in the current day, where we're going, where we're headed. And I just don't think that any of the pure forms, the ideals that, people conceive of, that were thought of in the 20th century, liberal democracy, communism, and fascism, I don't think any of those three things really have survived into the 21st century. Or to the extent that they do, they're all melded together in some strange, weird way. We have governments merging with corporations. We have corporate leaders trying to do social engineering, calling themselves responsible shareholders. We have, states like experimenting with social democracy, blending capitalism and socialism. And then that's all defended by military alliances that are doing this imperialist military adventurism and warmongering. So it's propped up by the threat of force. There are people who called FDR indeed a fascist, right? Since he doesn't abolish capitalism, he doesn't set the country on the road to communism. He, in a way strengthens capitalism. And he does it by introducing corporatism effectively into the American political life. And I don't mean that in the sense of corporations. I mean it in the sense of corpus, a body. America is all one body together, and so that's why we need this class collaborationism. But as part of the bargain, we'll expand the welfare state and the power of the federal government. And there were even conservatives like James Burnham who sort of had this insight that there was a thing like a managerial approach to governance that was common to all of these three new ideas. And he thought that social revolution thrived just as much in America as in the Soviet Union or in Nazi Germany. Whether you buy that argument or not, I don't think is really important. I guess the point I'm just trying to make is that all of these three pure ideals of where modernism was leading, they don't survive into the current day. They're no longer really relevant, in my view, in explaining the current moment. And so then, how was I using the term fascism in that video? Well, in a way, I'm trying to be true to the sense in which the term is commonly used, but also bring forth some sort of insight about the way that we commonly use the term. But it's not quite the way you describe it. You say I defined it as a process by which people cling to a common identity. Well, for one, I don't really think it's a process. I think it's a tendency. If you just want to use the Nietzschean terms, we're talking about herd morality, but we're, I guess, talking about a specific aspect of it. And I know I just said we shouldn't look to Mussolini and fascism to try and understand this tendency, but really what I meant by that is we shouldn't try to analyze the ideology as if that's the same ideology at all times in all places. But we can see in the symbolism that they use, right, the vibe, the aesthetic, the symbol of the fasces, the ceremonial axes of the Roman lictors, which consist of several sticks bundled together, that really shows what I'm trying to get at with this tendency. Because what that image is getting across is we are all strong together. Together we bundle into one powerful unit, which is then represented in the form of an axe, a weapon. Now, is it fascist just because it creates a common identity, a shared identity? Well, no. I mean, identity is a complicated thing. People have all sorts of identities associated with, their ethnic background, their nationality, their religion, their occupation, their hobbies, their family. And yes, also their ideas and ideology and political parties and things like that. But I would say every human being lives with some sense of shared identity with multiple overlapping circles of different groups. Again, to use Nietzschean language, the tendency that we're talking about here, it's the herd instinct in the individual. It's the instinct to instrumentalize yourself, not just to a shared identity, but to one which is reified. That's the essentializing that you're talking about. To subordinate yourself to it. And then, this is really important, to experience your power through that reified identity. And importantly, because we're talking about slave morality here, to express that power through that evaluative glance turned outward. To experience one's power in a reactive fashion by destroying what it is that you fear or that which does harm. Now, historically speaking, have many human beings lived like this? Have there been many polities established on this basis? I mean, absolutely. But there are a lot of things that people used to do that they don't do anymore, or that they do a lot less now, that are sort of contrary to the logic of the modern world, in a sense. And that's also why, by the way, I think I have a lot more faith than many people do that these old thought patterns and habits are eventually going to go the way of the buffalo because they're just not compatible with the modern world. And on this account, I will defend Francis Fukuyama and his thesis on the end of history, not insofar as there will, people misinterpret that as if he was saying history has actually stopped, no more historical events will happen. He's talking about a Hegelian end of history, a sort of final state of political consciousness, so to speak, that we've reached insofar as no one can conceive of any vision beyond liberalism. Even the dictators these days call themselves presidents. Even authoritarian regimes call themselves democratic republics. Perhaps, unlike Fukuyama, I think there will be further developments. There will be a new conception of politics that will be reached, but I don't think anyone can articulate what it is right now. In the same way that people, from the 1500s could not have had a grasp on the political situations that we live in today and the problems that face us and the technologies, social and scientific, that define our lives, they just wouldn't have had any sense for any of this. Asking somebody from the 1500s to sort of call balls and strikes about what's going to happen 500 years from when they live, they would be probably pretty bad at predicting any of that, right? And so I think it'll be obvious once it comes, once there is some sort of new political vision, or I don't want to say a new phase of human thought, but there definitely was a shift in modernity, and now we're in supposedly post-modernity or whatever we're in, meta-modernity, uber-modernity, if I have my way. And I think a new vision will be articulated. Many new visions will be. There will necessarily be new divisions and things like that. But that's kind of just getting off topic. I mean, if you really want to understand what I'm talking about with this thought tendency, I mean, sort of the other way into understanding it is really the Schmittian friend-enemy distinction. And the friend-enemy distinction does have to do with a conception of identity, but essentially an identity is defined by Schmitt, as it's like a particular group that defines itself in opposition to other groups. And so it's a way of defining identity which is inevitably, caught up with this idea of mutually exclusive advantages or harms. And I don't know how far I really want to go into the weeds with my thoughts on Schmitt. I am writing a little political essay basically attacking Schmitt right now, but I'll also talk about a lot of other things, Hobbes and Machiavelli and Aristotle and many other political thinkers. But to make a long story short, I think Schmitt gets it backwards from the very beginning, where he says the concept of the state depends on the concept of the political, and he goes on to define the concept of the political as the friend-enemy distinction. And I would say it's the other way around. The concept of the political depends on the concept of the state. And as for what I mean by that, politics really begins where the state of nature ends. And I think people get confused about this because, even with Nietzsche, because he describes nature as the bella omnium contra omnes, the war of all against all. But he does think that there is a meaningful development with the state. He calls it the cramp iron by which sort of the forces can be constrained. Their violent discharges can be sublimated. So, now in the Greek city-states, they're no longer within the city-state competing violently. Now they compete through social competition, through the agon. And I think there's just a whole school of thought that everything is war, right? Which is a Heraclitean point. And I understand what they're saying on a sort of poetic or artistic level. But I think it's equally important to recognize the way in which the war is done differently in the state of nature to the state of peace, or the state of civilization, right? Within the Greek city-state, you compete by these peaceful means, even if it is war by other means, whereas when they compete with one another, Athens versus Sparta or Athens versus the Melians, the rules are completely different. There are no rules, in fact. And again, just to appeal to common usage, I would say rules are inherently a part of politics. Conceiving of politics without any rules is just anarchy. It goes back to the state of nature. So it's why do you have people commonly assenting to follow one code of rules? There are all sorts of explanations for this, but there's some sort of change. There's some sort of meaningful change from the state of nature to living under a state, living a political life. That's where the political life really begins. If you deny that and you say the concept of the state presupposes the concept of the political, it's just an extension of the friend-enemy distinction, then it's just bella omnium contra omnes all the way down. The state never escapes from the state of nature, and therefore the state doesn't do anything. It's not a meaningful development. It doesn't actually take us out of the state of nature. And that, that was a thing I discovered from more closely reading Hobbes, that the state of war, as he calls it, that's his general term for the state that man lives in nature prior to the Leviathan, the establishment of the government, he describes it as essentially a mental condition, right? The state of war, he says it's not that we're at battling each other all the time. It's the fact that there's the constant threat of battle. It's the fact that you never can feel safe and therefore you can never trust. It's the state of mind it puts you in. It's the war footing, right? That's what it means to live in the state of war. And something does change demonstrably, manifestly. Obviously, something changes when we enter the state of peace because we have a completely different state of mind. We're able to interact with human beings on different terms, according to a shared set of rules. And so another way of putting this is that politics only occurs between friends. And I'm using politics here in the sense, again, in which we commonly use the term not in the idiosyncratic Schmittian way, which I think makes nonsense of politics. It makes nonsense of the development of the state. But unfortunately, there are many people of all sorts of political persuasions who, regardless of the ideology that they profess, they think in these Schmittian friend-enemy terms. They think according to that herd logic, that reactive logic, that slave moralist logic, and they try to import the state of nature effectively into the political life. And that's the way in which I would say my understanding of fascism as a cognitive tendency appeals to the common usage of the term, because that is the atavism that is coming back. That is the thing from the barbaric past that people are bringing into modern political life, when they resurrect fascism is they're resurrecting the friend-enemy rupture within a state, within the state of peace, and basically saying, no, politics is actually just the state of war again. It's actually friends and enemies. Whereas I think in political life, what we actually mean when we talk about politics, we are talking about a game played between friends that's not based on exterminating your enemy. It's not based on just rewarding friends and punishing enemies. I mean, really, when you look at the consequences of the Schmittian friend-enemy view, you would have to say mafiosos are the best statesmen, and that, corrupt officials and nepotistic officials, oh, that all makes sense. That's just what people do. And it's like, yeah, but doesn't every political system that functions try to restrain those behaviors, try to suppress those behaviors? No, you can't just use the state to reward your friends and punish your enemies, because that would be misusing the function of the state to foster some sort of common good for a group of friends. Now, I understand people could, say, Keegan, well, your argument, we still don't escape fascism in the sense of reifying a common identity, because it still happens on the national level or something like that. And fair enough. I mean, it might be that this is just an eternal tendency of human thought. And indeed, that seems to be what Nietzsche thought, that the gregarious instincts, the herd instincts, will always be there, and that the humanity as a species is not progressing towards anything. In fact, mankind, quote unquote, he says, does not advance. It doesn't even exist. That is an empty concept. And you could say that about all of these sort of formations, these superorganisms that we like to form out of our herds, these, which are really just, what I was trying to get at there with the essentializing or reifying is that it is just a conceptual unity. It's not a real unity. You're doing the same thing, like the same Platonic thing of where Nietzsche says our eyes gloss over the changeable, multifarious, phenomenal world and just see forms. And I mean, you can rest assured, if Nietzsche thinks the human race as a whole doesn't even exist, that's just mediating reality through a concept, then definitely all of the individual separate races that we have conceived of don't exist either. And that's not to say, like, there's no differences or people shouldn't celebrate, like, their ethnic heritage or whatever. It's just that in the grand scheme of things, these things are fluid. The boundaries are blurry. And every ethnicity that's come into being was from the genetic intermixtures of other ethnicities from the past, some of which may still exist, some of which may not exist anymore, only except in the form of their descendants. Same thing with national identities that come out. America like splits off from Britain. Is it still part of the Anglo world? Well, kind of, but there's all these changes and all of these sorts of things that have been grafted on, added on, mixed in. And it's just it's not clear that these conceptual fixed unities don't actually exist. They're just conceptions. And that may seem like a trite point, and I know people have advanced that point because they have their own political agenda. In some cases, they might even have a political agenda driven by Schmittian thinking themselves, that they want to break apart the concept of like a nation or an ethnicity. But I mean, I do mean this. Once it clicks with you and you really get that insight of that these conceptual unities are false, they're errors in the grand scheme of things. And to the extent that they're not errors, it's that they have in the past held value for life or for certain forms of life. You can't unsee it. You can't go back to an essentialized view of things. And I should clarify one of those last remarks. To the extent that they hold value, it's on the level of the gregarious values, on the level of the humanity as a herd individual or a herd animal, a herd organism. That is the extent to which these ideas have held value, is in preserving herds. A final note, there was an interview that with one of the guys who was involved with the Baader-Meinhof, like the anti-government protesters in Germany, West Germany during the 70s. And one of the members talked about a very strange experience where they went down to show solidarity with the Palestinians at that time. But there were all sorts of sort of disillusioning moments, and one of them was how they would, the fighters would point at pictures of Hitler and say, "Good man," that he killed our enemies, right? The enemies that we're fighting now, the Israelis. And so the Baader Meinhof guy was sort of like, he got into his whole revolutionary activity because of his opposition to how his society had gone fascist, and as a rebellion against the older generations sort of refusing to acknowledge their culpability. And he has this really interesting, this is in Adam Curtis's Can't Get You Out of My Head, but he has this really interesting sort of revelation where he says, I realized that we and the fascists are made out of the same stuff. And that's my way of saying it's human, all too human, right? I don't specifically judge and condemn certain individuals. I see this tendency everywhere. I do have hope. I do have faith that we will eventually overcome it, just like we have overcome many things. But, I don't, I know that Nietzsche would even take me to task for that, right? He would be like, what do you think humanity is going to advance, right? And I don't know, I guess I'd put it like this. I'm sure new problems will be created, right? I mean, that's the other side of the coin for Fukuyama. It's why he addresses Nietzsche in the final chapter of his book, The Last Man, right? There is that danger of sort of becoming the nihilist of nihilists. There might be all sorts of other problems as people start to overcome this black and white Schmittian thinking, this faith in opposite values. And I'm not suggesting that people are going to rationally choose to overcome this or that it'll be a moral project. I think oftentimes it is things like technologies and just social and material realities that affect changes and transformations. People do things out of necessity. But, I don't have a crystal ball. Regardless of what the future holds, I just know what represents the past, what represents a regression for the human race, and I know that these thought patterns are not a path to the future. And if Nietzsche is anything, he's a philosopher whose eye is turned to the future. And so I'm interested in what comes next. And I think that ultimately we don't do ourselves any favors by capitulating to these 20th century ideas over and over again. But I'm willing to capitulate to the way that people ordinarily use the word fascism and say, okay, well, here's what it is. It's this herd instinct in the individual that manifests in this Schmittian way of political thinking. And ultimately, it is a throwback. It is a regression to an earlier way of being. And one can't help but notice that it's mediocre people and failed specimens that always gravitate towards fascist thought patterns. So the proof is in the pudding. So I hope that answers your question, and I hope I haven't driven everyone crazy by talking about politics. But hey, again, we're talking about theory here, right? And I will the essay I'm writing on politics will of course go to the patrons first. Once I have no idea when I'll finish that, though. That's sort of like a side project at the moment. So thank you, Noah. Thank you for that question. Question from Graham04. He says, Hi, Keegan. I have been trying to read copies of Daybreak and Human All Too Human, translated by R.J. Hollingdale. I often find myself confused and unsure of what to make of some aphorisms, which slows down my reading by quite a bit. Do you have any advice on getting through each aphorism? Furthermore, it seems like some aphorisms are more important than others, so again, how do you determine what to spend extra time on? Thanks, I really appreciate the hard work you do and all your insight. Well, thank you, Graham. I guess my advice here would be the advice that I would give to people as regards reading philosophy generally. And really it comes down to two things. Go slowly and look up words or concepts or references that you don't know. And what I mean by that is, as far as going slowly, take it sentence by sentence. Take a step back and look at the whole. So within each aphorism, consider each of sort of the parts of what Nietzsche is raising, because oftentimes Nietzsche will start out raising, say, a possibility or giving an assertion, and he will seem to be moving in one direction, and then you'll often get like a turn or a reversal of perspective or something like that in the middle of the aphorism that will reveal where Nietzsche is really going with this. And then So take it slowly, analyze sort of all of the constituent parts of what Nietzsche is saying, and then look at the whole picture. And then it's very helpful to contextualize it. In many cases, I think Nietzsche, his aphoristic style can make it seem as though you can just pick out aphorisms, sort of cherry pick and read them, at your own leisure, wherever, without regard to any kind of structure. And Nietzsche is not writing, it's not where, again, Spinoza is the best example, where every single proposition that Spinoza raises is going to make reference to all of the past sort of assertions or proofs, as he sees it, that he's already built upon. And he begins to take things for granted that he feels that he's already proved. That is not going on in Nietzsche. And yet, in pretty much all of his works, there is kind of a logic or a flow to what he's doing. And so, a great example from The Gay Science is Book 3, where it opens with, where he's talking about, when Buddha died, he left a shadow in the cave wall, and God has died, but he still has left a shadow in the wall. The very next aphorism, he, by the end of it, is referencing the deification of nature. Again, all of these sort of conceptual mediations that we use to understand nature, which he calls shadows of God. And so you can kind of draw out more from either one of those aphorisms by seeing that they occur sequentially one after the other, and that there is, it is worth looking at it is worth constellating the ideas according to where they appear and in what context. And so go slowly with all of that. And the second thing I'm looking up, especially with Nietzsche, references that you don't know, because Nietzsche will talk about what might we say, like cultural, he'll talk about things, plays and operas and novels, and he'll talk about historical figures, and he'll talk about philosophers. And oftentimes, if you just gloss over that and you don't really know what he's talking about, he might be referencing something that to his audience was something that would be an illusion that they would easily sort of grab onto, right? Like if he's bringing up Goethe, or if he's bringing up Torquato Tasso, or if he's talking about the music of Wagner, everyone in Nietzsche's time who was at least educated or cultured to some degree would have known what Nietzsche was talking about pretty much immediately. But in modern times, that's not always the case. And so especially a work like, say, Birth of Tragedy, you have to do quite a bit of background reading. If you were to start completely as, you're a blank slate and you don't know anything about ancient Greek drama or culture or Wagner, you would have to stop at many points and go back and look up what he's talking about. So I don't know if I really have any specific sort of tips on Human All Too Human or Daybreak, but I will say I did write a 3-part sort of guide to Human All Too Human, extracting some of the core concepts, talking about Nietzsche's critique of free will, and then Nietzsche's view of art, which I think were like the most important things that came out of Human All Too Human. So you can look that up. I believe it's on my blog. I can post it in the Patreon, like a PDF version, if people think that would be helpful. I haven't done such a thing with Daybreak. The problem with Daybreak is it's a deeply transitional work. I would say, in between sort of the Human All Too Human period and the Gay Science period, and you can see many of the ideas that Nietzsche will later, like the will to power, is sort of bubbling up to the surface in Daybreak, but he still hasn't named the will to power. He's still thinking about things in terms of what gives us pleasure, or what gives us, he's still thinking about in terms of Lou Rochefoucauldian vanity. There's a long sort of sections on biblical exegesis in that work, and his thought is kind of all over the place, which it is in many of his works, right? But for example, in Human All Too Human and Beyond Good and Evil, and even indeed Twilight of Idols, there are these sort of chapter headings within which all of his thoughts are grouped. Daybreak is more like the Gay Science, in which, in fact, I believe He originally thought that the gay science was just going to be an extension of Daybreak. It was originally going to be like the next 5 books of Daybreak, but it's arranged in a very similar manner, where you just have these books where there are general topics, but it's harder to follow, is what I'm saying. And it's a cornucopia of great insights from Nietzsche. It's not the best reading experience, I would say. I will probably cover Daybreak eventually. Like, somebody already asked me in this Q&A if I'll do like a book club for Daybreak. And it seems that, it seems inevitable that eventually I will do a book club style analysis for every one of Nietzsche's books. So I'm sure we will get there eventually. But I would just follow the sort of my 2 rules for reading philosophy in general. Go slowly, make sure you're understanding what you're reading, don't gloss over things, and don't just read over references or concepts you don't understand. Look it up. It's never been easier to look it up, right? Back in the day, if you were reading Nietzsche and there's a reference to something you didn't know, you might have to go to the library. Nowadays, you have Google, you have the Internet Archive, you have Project Gutenberg, you have all sorts of resources that are available to you. So thank you, Graham, for that question. Next, we have Pratik Dash. He says, "Hi, Keegan. Nietzsche's perspectivism denies the existence of an absolute truth, a Ding an sich, or a monistic will. That being the case, why is there nonetheless a degree of inherent coherence among different perspectives? In other words, why do scientific truths or laws of nature exist at all? The scientific method attempts to infer the underlying structure of reality from observation, yet these observations are always perspectival. It therefore seems puzzling that such observations should consistently converge on what appears to be stable, law-like regularities. Does this suggest that we selectively organize or privilege certain observations in order to construct laws that are meaningful or useful to us? Even if that is so, science, physics in particular, has repeatedly revised its laws in response to observations that contradict earlier frameworks. Yet, there always seems to be some law in place which appears to point toward an underlying reality. I find it fascinating that the 2 major developments of 20th century physics, general relativity and quantum mechanics, both emphasize the perspectival character of nature while simultaneously positing a deep coherence among observations. Each theory contains universal constants that remain invariant across perspectives, such as the speed of light in general relativity or Planck's constant in quantum mechanics. From this standpoint, the entire scientific enterprise appears somewhat paradoxical. Despite Nietzsche's proclamation of long-lived physics, though perhaps physiology would have been the more fitting term, since perspectivism denies the absolute truth or underlying reality that scientists seem intent on uncovering. This tension is especially significant for contemporary research in fundamental physics, much of which is driven by the search for a theory of everything. Such a search presupposes that a unified comprehensive theory must exist, a presupposition rooted in the rationalist origins of the scientific method and in a near-sacrosanct commitment to causality. Thank you very much, Pratik. This is a great question. This is a rare moment in the Q&A where I'm going to start by actually reading a couple of quotes from Nietzsche that I think will make the underlying issues that he's dealing with much more clear. This is from On Truth and Lies in the Non-Moral Sense. It's towards the sort of the middle of the second essay. And I'm going to read here in abridged form. I'm going to skip over some sections as I read because there are some very relevant sentences, but I don't want to go on for too long. So Nietzsche says, quote, "It is not true that the essence of things, quote unquote, appears in the empirical world. Even the relationship of a nerve stimulus to the generated image is not a necessary one. When the same image has been generated millions of times and has been handed down for many generations, and finally appears on the same occasion every time for all mankind, then it acquires at last the same meaning for men it would have if it were the sole necessary image, and if the relationship of the original nerve stimulus to the generated image were a strictly causal one. In the same manner, an eternally repeated dream would certainly be felt and judged to be reality. But the hardening and congealing of a metaphor guarantees absolutely nothing concerning its necessity and exclusive justification. Every person who is familiar with such considerations has no doubt felt a deep mistrust of all idealism of this sort, just as often as he has quite early convinced himself of the eternal consistency, omnipresence, and fallibility of the laws of nature, he has concluded so far as we can penetrate here from the telescopic heights to the microscopic depths. Everything is secure, complete, infinite, regular, and without any gaps. Science will be able to dig successfully in this shaft forever, and the things that are discovered will harmonize with and not contradict each other. How little does this resemble a product of the imagination? For if it were such, there should be some place where the illusion and reality can be divined. Against this, the following must be said. If each of us had a different kind of sense perception, if we could only perceive things now as a bird, now as a worm, now as a plant, or if each of us saw a stimulus as red, another as blue, while a third even heard the same stimulus as a sound, then no one would speak of such a regularity of nature. Rather, nature would be grasped only as a creation which is subjective in the highest degree. After all, what is a law of nature as such for us? We are not acquainted with it in itself, but only with its effects, which means in its relation to other laws of nature, which in turn are known to us only as sums of relations. Therefore, all these relations always refer again to others and are thoroughly incomprehensible to us in their essence. All that we actually know about these laws of nature is what we ourselves bring to them, time and space, and therefore relationships of succession and number." End quote. And then next, I want to bring in a quotation. This is from Genealogy of Morals, section 12. Quote, "Let us, my philosophic colleagues, henceforward guard ourselves more carefully against this mythology of dangerous ancient ideas, which has set up a, quote, pure, will-less, painless, timeless subject of knowledge. Let us guard ourselves from the tentacles of such contradictory ideas as pure reason, absolute spirituality, knowledge in itself. In these theories, an I that cannot be thought of is required to think, an I which ex hypothesi has no direction at all, an I in which the active and interpreting functions are cramped, are absent. Those functions, I say, by means of which, quote, abstract seeing first became seeing something, in these theories, consequently, the absurd and the nonsensical is always demanded of the eye. There is only a seeing from a perspective, only a knowing from a perspective, and the more emotions we express over a thing, the more eyes, different eyes, we train on the same thing, the more complete will be our, quote, idea of that thing, our, quote, objectivity. But the elimination of the will altogether, the switching off of the emotions all and sundry, granted that we could do so, what? Would not that be called intellectual castration?" End quote. So, first of all, I mean, if you followed along with all of that, it should be clear that Nietzsche actually, On Truth and Lies in his early period, raises some of the same issues that you raise. He says, okay, so basically what we have is a nerve stimulus that is then discharged into a kind of image. Earlier in On Truth and Lies, he talks about how our eye just, we play this groping game over the phenomenal world where we gloss over all of the differences and multifariousness and just see forms. We see these unities. And, in this particular passage that I just read from, his point is that the reason why we are able to hold on to these unities and form consensuses around them is because how do I put this? It refers back to us and our physiology, our equipment for perception of the world, right? And the fact that we all sense things the same way. Now, if it were the case that a person, one person gets one stimulus and they have a completely different image formed, perhaps one person experiences one color as red, another person experiences a color as blue, another person experiences it as a sound, we wouldn't have this notion of the regularity of nature. So what he's saying is we do have this notion of the regularity of nature. And On Truth and Lies in the Non-Moral Sense, he points out how it has a utility. It allows us to calculate. It allows us to schematize the world. That is a real power. It's part of, in the Notes and Will to Power, he'll eventually say that the whole point of the intellect, for all its falsification of the world, right? The point was for us to master the world. And that's part of how Nietzsche mounts his argument sort of against the values that we have held up till now that have been forged in the consciousness, because the point was the mastery of the world, but we've ended up at this place where the values that we're following that seem to be endemic to conscious thought devalue the world. But that's neither here nor there. He absolutely recognizes the power of a consensus code of signifiers based on these conceptual unities formed out of nerve stimuli, which are, he's saying, there's no knowledge, we don't have any metaphysical knowledge that connects to any sort of essence. All we have is a kind of consistency of sensation, at least on like in terms of the vast majority of people, right? There's schizophrenics, there's people who have all sorts of, there's people who have synesthesia, there's all sorts of unusual ways of sensing, but at least the vast majority of people are able to form a consensus, and this gives us the power, therefore, based on that mutual consensus, to calculate and schematize. Great, right? But the fact that what he's saying is like it's the regularity of our equipment of sensation, right? It's the fact that our physiologies are, and therefore our perspectives, because even our perception of the world, even our perspective on it, is driven by or is shaped by impulse, right? There's this evaluative judgment of the drive. We've talked about this before, and Nietzsche thinks even our sense organs were formed by this, and our sense organs detect particular things. We detect photons, we detect sound waves, but Nietzsche points out in another place how we don't have a sense organ for the electrical field. Our eyes don't see ultraviolet light. We don't have, there's all sorts of things that we don't, Stefan Zweig describes Nietzsche as being like a human aneroid, as he's like a human altimeter, right? Which is a very interesting poetic turn of phrase, but it brings to mind something like, what if we had some sort of sense organ for detecting exactly what altitude we're at? Well, you can kind of figure it out. If you go hiking in the mountains, if you go really high up where there's less oxygen, you might feel lightheaded. You might, there could be all sorts of things where you could infer it, but it's not like directly seeing something. It's not like a direct sense perception. And so we have these 5 senses. We have 5 particular ways of getting nerve stimuli that give us a sense of the world. They don't touch the essence of things, is really Nietzsche's point. And the reason why we believe in the regularity of the world is actually because there's a regularity in ourselves in the way that we sense. That we see that the way I sense something is similar to the way you sense something. And so then to go to the passage in, and then, that's why he says in this passage on Truth and Lies, science will be able to dig successfully in this shaft forever. Science is, looking up to the telescopic heights, to the deepest depths. It's looking at the biggest things, the smallest things, the structure of the universe, subatomic particles. And it seems as though, the things that it discovers are not products of the imagination. It's not as though they are, like, if that were the case, Nietzsche says, you would expect that eventually scientists would begin to get like nonsensical results or contradictory results, things that can't be true, that would sort of allow us to divine the limits between our sensations and the essence of things, whatever it might be. But in fact, as he says here, that doesn't happen. The things that are discovered harmonize with one another and don't contradict one another. And as you point out, there are, the best science is a scientific mindset that allows for falsification and moving forward. But in general, what Nietzsche is saying is essentially what you suggest, that we find that there is this regularity of nature. There are these, indeed, laws that we extrapolate. But so just the point on Truth and Lies here, right, is that he's saying that regularity is within us. Because the grounding of our knowledge are these sense perceptions, this particular suite of sense perceptions shaped by our particular evaluative judgments of the world, and not even conscious ones, things that have been going on a pre-rational biological level since time immemorial. The fact that these have all been, sort of like honed and forged into something reliable and consistent across whole populations of people says something about humanity and the fact that our equipment for understanding the world and perceiving it leads us to this sort of sense that there is a regularity of nature. The issue is in making the leap to then saying that regularity is in the essence of things. And you invoke the passage "Long live physics," right? And I've often said really this passage needs to be understood counterposed to metaphysics, that Nietzsche's problem isn't with like if you look at the concept of scientific realism, right? His problem isn't with the science part, it's with the realism part. It's with extrapolating the things we learn from science into a world beyond the human that we're getting an inkling of. And he essentially is saying here, the regularity that we discover doesn't ever permit us to talk about regularity in the essence of things, laws of nature in the Ding an sich. What it permits us to speak of is regularity within us, within our sensation and representation of the world, which I don't think is a trivial point. That's a very important sort of grounding principle to understand. Knowledge and perception, all of this is human, all too human. And there's this desire to, well, let's go to the passage now in Genealogy of Morals, Essay 3, Section 12, where he says at the end, the elimination of the will altogether. So severing willing from thinking is a form of intellectual castration. Now, he also says in this passage, it's another sort of conciliatory statement to this idea of scientific objectivity, even though he puts objectivity in scare quotes, right? So it's not an objectivity in terms of a mind-independent objectivity, a human-independent objectivity. He says, what is our objectivity really? It's that we have a more complete, quote-unquote, idea of the thing. So we have a more, what might we say, certain and regular sense of what the fixed form that we create through our sensation and our conceptual mediation of the world, the more eyes we put on something, right? So quite literally, the more observation that we do from different angles, the more experiments we run, the more we can be certain of the regularity of nature as it always comes through to us in our sense perception of nature, in our empirical experience with it. But that doesn't ever, when you try to transcend, this is what the difference with Nietzsche's view by Genealogy of Morals is. He's making a broader point, like in the broader context of this essay, that the attempt to transcend the will, the attempt to say, okay, this perception of the world that we've gleaned from having all of these eyes on something, it never amounts to a kind of pure seeing, to a kind of immaculate perception. When you do that, you're trying to sever the eye that sees from the impulses that shape the organ, from the evaluative judgments, the physiological grounding of the organ, the fact that it does see from a particular perspective. All you can do is sort of stack up a bunch of particularities, a bunch of perspectives and counter-perspectives, and see what regularity emerges, again within us, within our perception of it. But when you try to sever the will away, Nietzsche essentially thinks this is part of in the essay on the ascetic ideal, that this is, I mean, in a way, it's the formula for dogmatism. It's part of the great error of Platonism, is the severing of the will from the intellect. And so I would put it to you, as I have many times on the podcast, Nietzsche's not anti-science, he's not anti-reason. He radically redefines what these things are and what they mean. He attacks anyone who thinks that science can itself deliver us over to the other side, to a metaphysical sort of certainty about the world, to a peering into the essence of things. He acknowledges the regularity is there, but it's there within us. And that's not us. I don't mean you as like a particular perspective. The fact that we don't all get different sense information, right? That you don't hear the color red as a sound, and I see it as the color blue, and someone else indeed sees it as red. The fact that that doesn't happen means that we do have a sense of objectivity and regularity. But, just to do a thought experiment, if we met aliens who had a completely different, like, let's say they didn't share any of our five sense organs. They have, let's say, their own five sense organs. And let's say that their senses for things that, like phenomena that we don't even know about. Because I've mentioned, like, the electrical field and altitude. What if, it's entirely possible in the chaos, right? The sort of the panoply of potential phenomena that are out there that we have no knowledge of. It's entirely possible that there are forces, that there are phenomena that we cannot only not directly sense, but couldn't even indirectly sense. And let's say their experience of reality is based on five senses for five phenomena that we don't have, right? They're sensing types of particles that we can't comprehend. They're experiencing, maybe some analogy to sound waves, but it's a different kind of wave that we don't have. Any number of things, right? Would we be able to come to some sort of mutual understanding of reality with such beings? And what I feel like the realists always say is like, okay, but yeah, at the end of the day, there is a reality that's above both, right? And it's like, no, that's what Nietzsche disputes. He would say that's a metaphysical position that you're taking. It's not permitted by science. It's actually insufficiently scientific. You should be aimed at stacking as many particular perspectives on top of one another to understand what the regularities are in the human world, which is only the world that appears. He doesn't have a concept. He's gotten rid of the concept of the Ding an sich, of the true world, the world, the essence of things behind everything. He says it's all just appearance. It's not, there's no illusory world and true world. It's all just the world of appearance. And that's like it's a really radical thing, but it's another one of those claims that when it clicks with you, you can't unsee it. And so to specifically answer your question, I don't think it actually seems puzzling that such observations consistently converge on what appears to be stable law-like regularities, because we all share the same physiology. We all share the same sort of like the regularities within us, right? The thing that Nietzsche is talking about is that it's tricking you. It's the consciousness tricking you when you sever that off from your willing, from your organs, from your nerve stimuli, and say, okay, now I've peered beyond the veil into the thing in itself. And I can now have knowledge that is separate from my will, that is separate from my perception. I guess the fact would be that Nietzsche doesn't think perspectival knowledge would be opposed to this idea of regularity. Like, it would just be chaotic, and you would expect in perspectivism that we would all, have this radically different experience of, phenomena. No, I think Nietzsche would say we should expect regularity. And, as for the impulse to find a grand unified theory, I think in a way Nietzsche would be all for that, right? What a grand and impossible task to pursue, is that not the same task of the pre-Platonic philosophers? But he recognizes within ideologies like scientific realism, materialist atomism, positivism, and these things, that there is a tendency that is, he thinks, the same tendency of Plato, the same tendency of the Christians or any ascetic ideal. He thinks there is that asceticism in science that can easily emerge, in which one thinks that they are, again, peering beyond the veil to the essence of things, and ultimately he thinks that comes from this impulse to separate the will from thought. So that would be my answer. I hope that makes sense of this to whatever degree possible. But thank you very much for the question, Pratik. Next, we have Eric Meyer. He says, first, I want to thank you for the podcast. It has enriched my life and also created some difficulties for me, difficulties which I welcome. My question is about an apparent paradox in Nietzsche's remarks about will in two contexts. On the one hand, will to power is central to his ideas. On the other hand, he says belief in free will is one of the four great errors. Just using the word error to describe that itself is troubling. Usually when you say something is an error, that means you could have avoided it, or at least stopped it and moved on to something else. So it sounds like he's saying one way to empower yourself, to honor your will to power, is to use your free will to stop believing in free will. From Nietzsche, who is always so precise, that seems like rather a muddle. Thanks again, Eric Meyer. Thank you for the question. I would just say on that last point, I don't actually think that's what he's saying. I think he would say whether you believe in free will or not. There's that great passage in Beyond Good and Evil where he sort of psychoanalyzes the types who believe in free will or unfree will. And he actually comes down much harder on the people who believe in unfree will in that passage. But for those who believe in free will, his psychoanalysis is something like, that it's the Munchausen daring to take on full responsibility for everything good and bad in your life, and sort of to place yourself in the sort of the high, that there's like a sense of pride coming out of this. The Munchausen daring refers to the idea of pulling yourself up by your bootstraps, or by your own hair, indeed, if we remember the original fable of Munchausen pulling himself up out of the swamp. So it's a kind of, and as you say, erroneous conception of the world, but it's one which is born out of this idea of like evaluating oneself as powerful and as the cause of effects. And Nietzsche says this in other places too. It's the desire to see oneself as the cause of effects out of this sort of the sense of I am that which is powerful, or I have a pride in myself. I'm willing to take on the responsibility. I'm willing to be the Deus ex machina myself. And then he comes down hard on the people who are for unfree will, basically saying that they're the kind of people who want to slacken their responsibility. They're the kind of people who are going to take up for the cause of criminals and for all of the badly turned out people because they want to see everything as no one's responsibility. And where does that come from within them psychologically? They don't want to see themselves as the cause of the effects in their lives. Now, obviously, Nietzsche makes a lot of different kind of remarks about free will over the years, as you mentioned, the four great errors, right, where he talks about it in very different terms. But this passage in Beyond Good and Evil, I believe it's number 21, shows, I think, very clearly that what Nietzsche, like, he regards the reason for our belief in free will as not something that comes out of free will. It's something that comes out of your psychological temperament, or which ultimately links back to your physiology, your drives. What is it that's driving you? So in other words, if you believe in free will, that's what you were always going to believe anyway, just like the person who is deterministic. It's in some way part of that thing he talks about in the gay science of finding a sun to shine on your life and find a way of thinking about the world that justifies your way of living in the world. That's where happiness is found, and thus, many people have come up with these different accounts of free will or determinism that ultimately are just that. They are the values that are driving them, justifying themselves. But the other thing that I would say, because you bring up will to power is not, it's explicitly opposed to the idea of free will. What Nietzsche is doing is essentially taking the idea, which he says is a prejudice that was drummed into people as a way of making them morally responsible by subjecting them to guilt and punishment, and thus creating this idea of the ego as this intermediary between our thoughts and our actions, and seeing the origin of our actions in our thoughts. Nietzsche gives us a completely different picture. He doesn't think there's this one unified thing that can will, this one ego, right? He even breaks down, you should see the passages where he critiques the will and where he says the entire concept of will is just a popular prejudice. We're not even talking about free will. He's just saying, when you talk about, oh, my will did this, or you need willpower to do that, Nietzsche essentially asks, how is it that will moves anything? You're talking about a mental activity. Is it a mental activity that somehow moves the physiology? How does that work exactly? How is it that we're confounding, nerve stimulus, muscular movements, mental operations, a whole series of emotions about things, actual movement of the organism toward or away from something, evaluative judgments, interpretations of life? This is all involved with this word will. And these are non-identical things. These are not, there's no common identity of the will that makes sense of all of these operations within the organism. And so Nietzsche instead gives us a multiple picture of the organism based on drive, in which the thought is not the thing that, it's not that we think I am going to do this, and then that, causes that's like sort of a decree from a sovereign governing ego that then makes the organism do something. No, he says the thought comes as part of the operation of willing, as one of the signs or symptoms of the will. That the thought isn't the thing steering the ship. It's, in some sense, it's like the end of the process. And that thinking, as I just mentioned in relation to Pratik's question, thinking and willing are, in some sense, the same activity. And that's a very strange thing to think as well, because what he's saying there is that the way we ordinarily conceive of the will as this sort of, what would it be, like a thing or a substance, or it's like it's coterminous with or synonymous with your ego or your personality or your values that you hold or something like that. But in some sense, it's this like this coherent identity, like you have a will, my will is aimed at this, I'm applying my willpower to do that. And he essentially says, no, let's look at the human being physiologically. The will is something that is synthesized out of the impulses. The thoughts that we have that are associated with our actions, so too are synthesized out of the impulses. The impulses themselves, of which these things are comprised, are themselves non-identical. So you have all these competing drives with one another. And what happens when, when it breaches into consciousness is usually when one drive has triumphed over the other, and then the consciousness then accounts for, justifies, provides a sort of post hoc moral language or something of that nature in order to explain what the organism has done to itself, or to give a story a justification for its way of being in the world to itself, or indeed to others. So that's the biggest problem for all of this. The human being is not one thing. It's multiple on a physiological level, on a psychological level, in Nietzsche's picture of the human being. And so you don't just have like a will. He thinks that concept doesn't explain anything. It's just a placeholder name that we've inserted into the picture, and it doesn't get us anywhere closer to the understanding. If anything, it mystifies what's going on in the human being. And so in a way, long story short, will to power is his explanation, or it's a description of human action, or indeed life itself, that actually completely sidesteps free will and does an end around free will. It's a way, if I wanted to be sort of provocative, I might even say that Nietzsche is using the word will in the sense of describing will to power in a way that is like the opposite of what will conventionally means. So you think the will is one thing, you think it's a unity. In fact, it is multiple. It's made up of non-identical things. You think that your intellect directs the will. No, the wills, plural, direct the intellect. In fact, the intellect is sort of like woven out of them. You think it's free to act. You think it's basically, that our will is like the will of a god. Nietzsche says, no, in fact, that's recapitulating to the most primordial prejudice possible, that personified forces are like the decisions of personal beings like gods are what's affecting everything, are the causes of all the effects in the world. And so long story short, it seems like what you're really struggling with is, do I have the free will to believe in free will or not? And Nietzsche would say no. Essentially, you will have the beliefs that are appropriate to you, that you deserve according to who and what you are, and that's just the way it is. I don't think Nietzsche is going to I'm going to eliminate these errors that people have, these conceptual errors about freedom of the will, and that will improve society or something like that. Now, on the other side of that coin, there is the Spinozistic argument. It's solely through the understanding, right? So it's not that your will needs to be marshaled in order to believe in free will, but if you know, right, if it's made clear to you in a sense that, I don't want to even say logically, like just think of something that is indisputably true to you, that you know, that no philosophical argument, even if somebody could make a philosophical argument to get you to try and doubt it, at the end of the day, you wouldn't really doubt it because it's not dubitable to you. If you had that same experience, that same insight where you're like, I know for a fact there's no free will. Regardless, like I don't have perfect knowledge. I don't have absolute certainty about anything. I don't know about the essence of things in itself, but I've had the insight where it's indisputably true to me. We don't have free will. Is it really then a question of whether my will, whether I choose to believe in it or not? It's sort of like, in the same sense that I know there's not a unicorn in the room with me right now. I know that free will doesn't exist. So this issue doesn't really bother me because of that issue. I feel like I've had the insight that enough insight into myself particularly, but also seeing how other human beings behave, and also reading Nietzsche and the insights he brings, that I'm fairly confident that free will doesn't exist. And it's not really, I don't have to struggle with making that decision of, do I believe in free will or not? I guess the other thing, because you talk about, empower yourself, honor your will to power or something like that. Well, you do say this, it sounds like he's saying use your free will to stop believing in free will. But even this sort of idea that many people have, maybe it's not what you're saying here, but many people get caught up in this idea that it's disempowering to not believe in free will or something like that. And I just don't think that's true, right? I don't think that, like, let's say that if it were the case that there's no free will, would that knowledge be disempowering? Well, is the acquisition of knowledge disempowering? Knowledge is power, if we believe Francis Bacon, right? So, if you know when you're talking to other human beings that you're not talking to an autonomous, rational entity that is like guided by a will that he is in control of, you're talking to a chimera that has all sorts of impulses operative within him and is non-identical, and it will make much more sense of the world. And you'll actually be much more prudent, I think, in your dealings with other people and your dealings in the world and your understanding of yourself. You can be much more forgiving with yourself. Not beat yourself up when you do something that in retrospect you say, why did I do that? You can kind of look and say, well, there's a history, there's a genealogy I can look at here of my actions that spring from impulses that, from these unconscious operations. And you can try and, I think that podcast with Will to Joy with Jimmy Burke was really great for this, because he was sort of talking about evidence-based behavior change and how, you nudge yourself, you put yourself in the proper environment. You use reason, not because reason has this power to autonomously govern the self, but because as an organism acquires more knowledge, it becomes more powerful, right? It's not like an aspect of like, I need to make the choice to self-improve. It's like, if you gain the power, if you gain the knowledge to self-improve, and, not everyone will do this because some people are sick and pathological, and that's the fate that they deserve. That's the fate they'll create for themselves. But in general, if you gain the knowledge and gain the power to nudge yourself in the right direction, you will do that. And it doesn't require free will. Like, essentially, we just believe in magic where this free will thing is concerned. We're inserting this totally unnecessary hangover from a primordial state of consciousness about, I think Nietzsche's right. It harkens back to the days when gods were in everything. And thus we think there's a God in each of us that is enthroned over the self, making these decisions. It's a completely worthless hypothesis. It doesn't get us anything. And other than, I guess the thing you could say is that, as Nietzsche says, there is a certain pride or energy or vigor that comes from wanting to see oneself as the cause of effects and wanting to sort of take ownership of oneself. So there could be perhaps a life-preserving illusion going on there, and maybe that's the best argument I could say on behalf of free will. But I would say, at least for me, I have not found that to be necessary. I have found that I am perfectly able to operate in the world without believing in free will. And, and just like Nietzsche says, that these things, these conceptual mediations, these forms that we incline to, I naturally find myself sometimes thinking in terms of free will, but it's always when I bring to mind that, that's like a conceptual error that you're making. It allows me to be more prudent and more productive and all sorts of things. It's actually enriched my life to not believe in free will. So that kind of goes off topic from your question, but I hope I was able to answer that. So we will move on to Rachel Lichtenwalter. Hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. They say, this is my favorite podcast. Thank you. Have you read the book that Lou Salome wrote about Nietzsche? And if so, what are your thoughts? I'm reading it now and find it fascinating considering how close she was to our main attraction. Yeah, Lou Salome is one of those figures that sort of like Nietzsche's sister gets a lot of, I don't want to say hate. It's like the people who don't like Nietzsche will sort of invoke Lou Salome, either the story about unrequited love or some of the claims she makes in that book to like discredit him or make fun of him. And then Nietzscheans will, sort of be very dismissive of Lou Salome and very hateful towards her. And there's just this sort of thing that goes on, right? And I think you need to be able to like wash that crap out of your brain before you approach before you're able to think clearly. Because if you do read Lou's book, which I have read, it is a really fascinating read. Now, it has been quite a long time. I went and found it from the shelf, and I perused through it and thumbed through it when I was doing the Klosowski episodes. And it really reminded me of like, this is a really unique work, right? Because it's it's the first biography we get of Nietzsche. It's written while he's still alive, and it's written by somebody who knew him. And even though I think you have to keep in mind it's just Salome's perspective, she says things, I think, philosophically. She says things about the motivations for his philosophical beliefs. Like Klosowski actually critiques her for this, right? He thinks she's incorrect or goes a bit too far in a few places in assessing these things. But I think you're right. I think it's an incredibly valuable resource, and I don't know how much I have to say about it at the moment in this Q&A, except that you asking me this question has sort of put the thought in my mind, we should just talk about Lou Salome's book about Nietzsche, because I've kind of talked about Lou Salome here and there. I've never really done an episode about her, and that might be a cool way to do it, right? Do an episode where I talk about Lou Salome and her whole life, and then talk about her book on Nietzsche, and sort of give my assessment of it, and then also, as I like to do, just give the most sober presentation of her work that I could give. And so that could be really, really fascinating. So I don't know how much more I have to say at the moment, but Rachel, I think you've kindled an idea in my mind for a future episode. So thank you for that. Next, we have Bart Rimmelsval. Again, I hope I'm pronouncing that right. He says, "Hey, I'm quite new to the channel, and it's the first time I'm getting serious with reading Nietzsche. Having you as a companion is incredibly helpful. Thanks." Thank you. My question is regarding Nietzsche and music. How highly do you as a musician regard Nietzsche's views on music? I'm not too familiar with Nietzsche's views on music yet, but without too much knowledge of his writings, I find his shift to praising Bizet's Carmen quite surprising. Maybe some people really like Carmen, but for me, it is quite a dull and shallow opera. Sure, it has some nice tunes and stuff, but that's about it. What was Nietzsche's argument for this shift, and don't you think it has to do with his ressentiment against the Wagners? My second question would be, did Nietzsche also have things to say about absolute music that is not programmatic? Cheers. P.S. I haven't listened to your series on Birth of Tragedy or read the book yet, so I hope I'm not making you repeat yourself too much. Thank you for this, Bart. And man, first of all, I would just say I would love for Bart to interact with Gutso Pink, who's another patron who would totally defend Nietzsche's shift toward Carmen, and he would agree with Nietzsche seeing romanticism in Wagner's music. I would say that you're kind of asking two questions here, right? Because Nietzsche's views on music are very broad and far-reaching, but you're also asking about sort of these questions of taste in a way, right? About Nietzsche's opinions about specific musical pieces, which I think is a kind of a separate issue from his overall views on music. Was Nietzsche resentful towards Wagner? I mean, it's possible. Did he have a legitimate criticism of Wagner? I think so. I guess it ties into his overall views on music, because I think Nietzsche really does believe that music can be the bleeding edge of creating new valuations, that music is this really powerful medium. And if the values that are being conveyed in music are sick, if the musician becomes like a magician who's manipulating people, who becomes an expert on playing on the heartstrings in order to conjure, in the case of Wagner, romantic feelings, Nietzsche, he would later say he came to recognize the sickness within Wagner's music. Was that part of his personal beef with Wagner? Again, it's quite possible, but I think he's making a real case against Wagner in the case of Wagner, that there is philosophical content too. So we can examine it from the angle of Nietzsche's psychology, or we could look at it as Nietzsche essentially seeing that Wagner's romanticism comes through in his music, and it is turning Germany into a nation of romantics. Now, you mentioned Birth of Tragedy, and I think that's where Nietzsche's at his most Wagnerian, but I think there he presents this sort of understanding of music that is really insightful, and I would say, apart from all of the Wagnerian stuff, I have really taken to heart in associating the musical with the Dionysian, music being essentially formless, or it doesn't exist in space. It says Nietzsche is essentially identifying the difference between spatial art, the plastic arts, Apollo, which is an art of form, to music, which is a temporal art, which is more of an experience, or more in the realm of direct sensation. And given Nietzsche's Schopenhauerian influence at the time, we can see how the Dionysian sort of becomes like the will, and the Apollonian is more akin to the representation. Obviously, he would move beyond this, and the Dionysian comes to mean something much more than that. But there's something about the idea of music sort of being non-representational as an art form, right? The fact that it does speak directly to the heart. And I'm going to talk about this again in the episode on Stefan Zweig, and his assessment of Nietzsche. And he compares Nietzsche and Goethe, and how Goethe held music at a distance because he saw how when he was at his most vulnerable, music had the greatest hold over him, whereas Nietzsche gives himself over fully to music. And in fact, after Nietzsche loses his mind, one of the few things he can still do, even though he can't hold a conversation at this point, he doesn't know where he is, what year it is, he'll still go over and play the piano. And so I think there's something about the viscerality of music, and the fact that, he raises the question in Birth of Tragedy of whether a people could be gripped by mass hallucinations, whether a musical experience could sort of change their entire perception of reality, whether they could lose themselves, lose the representational world, and sort of go like touch the primordial pain and contradiction of reality, undergo ego death and come out reborn, that if this is what constituted the Dionysian mysteries. And that view of music, at least, is very congenial to me as a musician. And I think, what Nietzsche's saying, again, it also aligns with what Socrates says about the power of music, about the power of poetry. What Socrates says in the Phaedrus, or in the Ion, where he describes because you have to remember, poetry at this time is music. Poems are sung. They're not just sort of recited. They're not just read in the form of on words on the page. The poem was part of a musical art form, and Socrates describes the poets as essentially spirit-possessed. And he says that this is dangerous because essentially they can manipulate how other people feel. They can hold sway over the passions. And Socrates' entire project involves a regulative regime over the passions. So when you have music, it can sort of breach into this regime. That's why music then has to be regulated, right? There's the famous things in the Republic about regulating the scales and modes that can be listened to by the different castes in society according to their function in society. And it's because if you don't have this orderliness with how music and poetry and the arts in general are experienced, but music is certainly the most powerful one, right? Because again, it's formless, it's non-representational, it can simply penetrate beyond the intellect and make you feel things. You can bypass your rational defenses and sort of enter the citadel of your heart. Music has to be regulated as well for Socrates. And I think Nietzsche sees the power of music and says, this is the power, this Dionysian power. This is why he talks about Dionysus to the end of his career. Dionysus and music have this association in his first book. And even though he's not Schopenhauerian, even though he's not Wagnerian anymore, by the time he gets to the end of his career, there's still this notion that music can be the spearhead of the revaluation for the precise reasons that Socrates feared, right? So those are the kinds of ideas that, for me, are most compelling about Nietzsche's views on music. When it comes to his opinions on Wagnerian operas, again, is there an element of the personal problems with Wagner? Quite possibly. I've talked about this in the episode on Wagner that I did, or two-part episode, where it's very strange the way that Nietzsche describes Wagner and his fall into romanticism, that he essentially says, Wagner became Christian, he became romantic. It seems clear to me that what actually happened was Nietzsche was a romantic. He certainly wasn't a Christian, but he was a Schopenhauerian, and Schopenhauer thinks there's some sort of underlying philosophical or spiritual truth revealed by Christianity, even if it's just in the religion is sort of like the plebeian form of metaphysics, right? And so, the denial of the world and the ascetic ideal that Christianity conveys, Schopenhauer's all for that, even if he thinks the religion itself and the superstitions and the supernatural beliefs are not true. And so, the fact that it points us in the direction of negating the will, I mean, Nietzsche was on board with that. And And Schopenhauer was by far Wagner's favorite philosopher. He remains a dyed-in-the-wool Schopenhauerian from the beginning to the end. And even though he embraces sort of the national religion of Christianity and all of these things, and Nietzsche brings all that up as a beef with Wagner, which I think is, these are valid critiques, but I do think it is a little strange, and it does point to Nietzsche having some sort of lack of self-awareness about this when he describes sort of his break with Romanticism and realizing that Wagner was a romantic, or that Wagner fell more deeply into Romanticism, whereas it's clear to me, no, you were both Romantics, you were both Schopenhauerians. And then you changed. I don't think Wagner changed, right? Nietzsche often writes as if Wagner changed. Wagner got worse, when I think really it was that Nietzsche was the one who changed. Now, as regards this question about absolute music, I don't recall that Nietzsche writes about absolute music, or I don't think he ever invokes that specific term. Nietzsche does say that, and this is in Birth of Tragedy, that essentially the lyrics and the imagery that is conjured from music, that the real power is the music, and the lyrics are along for the ride, we might say, or that they're drawing on the power of the music. That in a way, the imagery, the lyricism, the rational story, the message, like in an opera per se, or for example, is sort of parasitical on the power of the music. And that Nietzsche's big problem with the direction opera was going was where the libretto had taken on this great importance, the storyline, and it was sort of like all of this stuff that was built on top of the music had become more important. And that's why there's like a cultural critique involved with Birth of Tragedy, because he traces how there's a parallel in the Greek world where originally the tragedy is only music. It's only the Dionysian dithyramb, and then only chorus, and then the drama comes after. All of these things are sort of stacked on top, drawing on the power of the music, but the music is the origin. That's the real beginnings. And, he explicitly denies, or he goes after people who will say things like, this symphony sounds like a day in spring, or, that this is a pastoral idyll in the form of music. And he essentially says these are all sort of like post hoc or second order interpretations of the music that are, they're, it seems like so obvious to say this, that they're subjective, but that, the music isn't about anything representational. To the extent it's about something, to use Schopenhauerian language, it's about a story of the will. So it's a story of drives, emotions, values, disappointments, tragedies, all these things. There is a drama that plays out in music, but all of the things that are sort of the imagery and the representations of that, the lyricism and all of that, again, is all added on. And it's something that draws on the power of the presentation of the will that the music is giving us. So I don't know if that really answers your question, but that's probably the closest closest way that Nietzsche ever comes to really commenting on that issue. So, all right. Thank you, Bart. Thank you very much for those questions. Next, we have a question from Richard Burrell. He says, hello, Keegan. Have you read any of the Stanford University Press Nietzsche translations? I've begun to dig into them, and the afterwards, supplementary notes, and eventual complete translation of all the notebooks make it seem really worth my time. I'm not sure how the actual translations compare, though. Some of the changes are marginal from Kaufman or Hollingdale, but some of them are very different, such as untimely meditations becomes unfashionable observations, daybreak becomes dawn, and the gay science becomes the joyful science. And then he asks, thoughts? Well, thank you for that, Richard. But, given how you ended with like the different translations of the titles, are you asking me for my thoughts on the translations of those titles? I would actually disagree with all of those creative decisions. And it is a creative decision, by the way. This is kind of why I don't generally comment on translations or tell people which translations to read. For one, I'm not an expert on translations because I'm not a translator, for one. But also, people are trying to get different things out of translations. It's not that, one isn't objectively better than others. Now, it could be in the sense that if something is just straight up mistranslated, or they take, concepts and just really badly render them into English in a really obscure way, in a way that's very hard to like parse out. But in general, like there's different things people are looking for. So some people really want precision. They really want rigor in the translation. Even what that means, though, can be different because German's a very different language. You have these long run-on sentences. You have the ability to just smash multiple words together and create new concepts with these long, basically run-on words. So how do you translate some of that? I mean, you could translate it in a hyphenated form in English, or you could try and find a word that, sort of gets across what's being said. And I don't recall the German at the moment, but a term Nietzsche uses often is, say, for example, well turned out, when he's talking about a well turned out individual, in contrast to a badly turned out individual. So that's obviously like a hyphenated phrase, right? You could also say like well constituted. But well constituted and well turned out, do those two things actually say the same thing? Well, in a way they do. It's kind of getting at the same underlying idea. But well-constituted has this idea, really the thing that's being conveyed is being put together well, whereas well-turned out is sort of like at the end of the process. Like well-constituted, we might say, would be better applied to like putting together a machine or a government or something like that. But well turned out might be better, like my cake turned out well, something I baked. This at the end of this process, the thing that came out was the way that it should be or something like that. So there's no like real perfect, precise translation. So even people's understanding of the definition of precision can be different. And then some people don't even want that. They want readability, right? Or they want poetry. They want the lyricism to come through. Or any number of things that people might be looking for in translations. And for example, with Zhuangzi, I'm definitely not an expert on translating Chinese to English at all, but I read so many translations of Zhuangzi, and I know that the Martin Palmer translation is generally bashed on and it does have all sorts of problems. I am not saying there are not problems in that translation. There are, and I can see that when I look at multiple translations. But, there were just sections or passages where I could tell other translators had prioritized precision over readability, or they had prioritized, I really want this one sort of implication or connotation of what he's saying to come out in English, but it makes the thing clumsier, right? And so it's all these creative decisions that are made. And so it's very hard to say which one is better in total. And so that's why I always tell people the best thing to do is read multiple translations. That's what I do. If you read 4 or 5 different translations of the same book, you will find, as you say, most of the changes that they make are marginal. And then there will be some things, some concepts that it's not as though usually I find the case isn't that somebody said it better than someone else. It's that by looking at all the different ways of rendering it into English, I'm like, I get it. I see what's being said here, that perhaps the concept isn't directly translatable into English, or the turn of phrase doesn't exist. And all the different ways of doing it sort of bring it to light, And there you go. There's a reference to Pratik's question, putting multiple eyes on something. That's our objectivity, right? So that's how you really get a sense of what is actually being said beyond the translation, is by reading multiples. Stanford University Press, people have generally said is pretty good. I don't have any experience with them. I think I've read more like the Cambridge University Press stuff from Nietzsche. But again, to go back to the title, so untimely meditations versus unfashionable observations. Observations is probably, that might be a better way to render Betrachtungen, but I think it loses some of the poetry there. The observations is more, it's more neutral and more dispassionate. Meditations, or that this seems like more like it has more of a ruminating quality, or more of a introspective spiritual quality, right? So I think there might be a bit of a connotative difference there that I don't know if I like, even though observations I think is more literally correct. But unfashionable, I don't like that, because it's unzeitgemasse, so Zeit, time. I'm not saying the literal translation is better, but Nietzsche's not referring to the concept of something being fashionable. He's referring to something being out of step with the times, which I guess you could say being unfashionable is out of step with the times, but unfashionable also has like I don't know, it has a very trivial sort of quality to it. Like, oh, that's not in fashion to believe that. Whereas I think Nietzsche, it's far more profound to invoke the idea that I am meditating on these things as though I were sort of outside of my given time and place. So I don't actually like the particular title. Doesn't mean that the translation of the untimely meditations that they provide isn't better, right? There have been many translations I've read where their rendering of the title, I'm like, I don't know if I would have gone with that choice, but the actual content is good, right? So what do they say? Don't judge a book by its cover. Daybreak to dawn, that's totally anyone's, the word is Morgenrot, which means red dawn, which has a very sort of like, there's an allusion being made there to sort of cultural associations with what a red dawn means that don't really come through in English. I like daybreak because it has the word break in it, so it sounds more active. It sounds more, I think the idea of Morgenrot, the red dawn, was a bit more, dawn, when we think of just, the dawn, it's a very peaceful, idyllic image, whereas daybreak makes it sound more active and less sedate, I guess, which is conveyed by Morgenrot because it's like the dawn's rosy fingers and the association that, red sky and morning, sailor take warning. It's sort of the dawn of a fateful day, something like that. But, it doesn't really translate into English. That's why when my band, we wrote a song called Morgenrot and left it untranslated because I like that word to be untranslated because nothing really conveys it. And then the gay science to the joyful science. I mean, I guess that's fine. I think a lot of this, guys, is just cowardice. People don't want to say gay, like they're afraid to say gay. And the fact that Nietzsche's gay science, right, it's a devil-may-care science. It's a frolicking science. It's a science of, it's a way of being and philosophizing that does not care about such things as timely, fashionable valuations of how we speak or how we think. And so capitulating to that and saying, well, the word gay now means people might think I'm gay. If I talk about the gay science, it's like, that's just cowardice and capitulating to timely things, right? And the fact that it is supposed to be gay in the sense of being transgressive. Like the word gay doesn't actually just mean joyful, guys. Like it did always have this idea of being carefree, of being an innocent child, right? Like a child who runs and goes over and like knocks over the sandcastle that his brother just built, and his brother starts crying, but he doesn't even care. And it's not because he's malicious. He's just transgressed and hurt some feelings, but it's just, he was just innocent, just doing what he was doing. He doesn't have a care in the world. And when we grow up, we lose that childlike innocence. And that's why Nietzsche's ideal, or the final metamorphosis, is that of the child, of recapturing the innocence of youth. And so there's a sort of transgressive, devil-may-care innocence that's conveyed in the word gay. And I guess joyful's fine. It's not like wrong, but I think people are just shying away from that now. I've heard a lot of people be like, "Oh, the word means something different, so I don't want to translate it that way now." It's like, if you were truly being gay in the sense Nietzsche means in the gay science of being carefree, you wouldn't care about that. And so for me, I like the original translation that we've used because now it's a filter. Now it filters out the people that are too juvenile and immature to handle saying that word, right? Because they have, if you're that juvenile, then you have no place philosophizing. It's not for you. You go watch Disney's Marvel's The Avengers Part 7. This is for adults. So that's kind of a tangent. I'm not saying that Stanford University Press made that calculation, but I think it's just, that's another change that I wouldn't agree with. So again, don't judge a book by its cover. I'm only commenting on these titles because you posted them, and I guess have a kind of a negative reaction to all three of them. But definitely, I would encourage you to keep reading these translations and read them in conjunction with others. I always stand for Walter Kaufmann because we happen to have a great corpus of translated works that are great, that do the job, that convey what Nietzsche's saying. And when I compare Kaufman to these other translations, people are like, oh, you have to read Colli and Montanari. Oh, you have to read this, that, or the other. And I compare them to Kaufman. And I'm like, as you say, that a lot of these changes are not really that profound. Or it's not like where I don't think I've ever read one of these new translations and be like, wow, Kaufman was totally wrong. And he misrepresented that. I've never had that experience. It's sometimes where they put things in a different way where I'm like, oh, that's interesting. That insight didn't quite come out. But it's never where I'm like, oh, he Bowdlerized the text. That people exaggerate this greatly. But I would say it's great. Read as many translations as you can. And especially, I'm sure, most university presses are going to produce pretty good translations of philosophers. They have people who devote their entire lives to doing this stuff. And so that's the other thing is as an amateur, as an autodidact myself, there are a lot of people in the autodidactic world of philosophy or any number of other subjects online who are very dismissive of academia these days. And I think that's a mistake. You should probably have some respect for the people who spend their whole lives working on this stuff. But anyway, Richard, thank you for the question. Wronski, it seems to be, at least in Germany, the standard one that's always recommended. And I saw that it has an English translation as well. Therefore, I was wondering if you have read it, and if yes, what your opinion on it is. Do you think it presents Nietzsche's philosophy and the development of his thoughts well? I'm thinking about getting it, but wanted to hear some opinions first from someone who knows a bit more rather than trusting some random Amazon reviews. Well, yeah, that's a good call. But unfortunately, I can't really help you on this front because I haven't read it. So, this is one of those questions where I wish I could give you more than just saying I haven't read it. But I can't. I have heard many people recommend it. Maybe that is a book that I will look into in the future, maybe to do an episode on. But yeah, I can't. All I can say is it has been recommended to me by other people who are in the know, people who I trust. I'm trying to remember who specifically has recommended it to me, but I can't off the top of my head. But Safransky has come up multiple times. So, there's got to be something there. And if it's the standard one that's always recommended in Germany, that's saying something too. So, that would be my take. Maybe you'll just have to do your own research on it because I can't really help you on that front. But thank you for the question. Next we have Mathis Bogue, I think is the name. He says, "Hi Keegan, the podcast has affected me in ways words cannot describe. You're the best. My question regards Nietzsche and the Romans. Nietzsche holds ancient Greece and especially the pre-Platonics in high regard. Did he as a classical philologist say much about great Roman works, Virgil's Aeneid, Ovid's Metamorphoses? Another question, Nietzsche seems to want to focus epistemology entirely on the phenomenal world, but wouldn't you say that the sort of noumenal out there's idea of truth has been an incredibly useful striving? If we took our senses at face value, we might have never discovered something like infrared or atoms. Believing that more truth or explanation can be found outside of our current capacity seems to bear many fruits. Maybe I've misunderstood Nietzsche in this regard. I think he means to say I've been contemplating about this for a while. Thank you, and Amor Fati. Thank you very much for these questions, and Amor Fati to you as well. First on the Romans, Nietzsche has surprisingly few comments on the Romans. There's some sections in What I Owe to the Ancients where he compares the Greeks and Romans, and I think one of the most informative lines is where he says, who could have learned writing from a Greek? We could have only learned it from the Romans. And I think there's something there, like it'll be useful to go back to We Philologists, the unpublished, untimely meditation, where Nietzsche says that in order to see the reason why things became what they were, we can look to the Romans. To see how things could become other than what they are, we can look to the Greeks. Or we could think about his lectures in the pre-Platonics where he says the Romans are an intensely practical people and that essentially they never really had much use for philosophy. Now, obviously, there are Roman philosophers. There's great Roman works, as you mentioned, the Aeneid or Metamorphoses. We have people like Cicero, We have like Roman Stoics. But in general, I think Nietzsche would say that, the civilization, like Western civilization as we call it, comes out of Rome more than Greece. That when we look back to the Greeks in comparison to our modern values, they could almost seem like, space aliens in some way. That's what he means when he says, to see how things became what they were, we could look to the Romans. And as regards literature and the remark in Twilight of Idols on literary styles, I think it's most clear in that domain, which is why I bring up both of those quotes at once, because it really demonstrates that, when you read Cicero, you could be reading something that was written, I don't want to say like in the present day, but at least in translation, what Cicero, the way he structures his arguments and the way he thinks and the way he writes, could have been written in the Renaissance or indeed in modern times. Whereas, at least in Nietzsche's opinion, when you read something like, Aeschylus's Oresteia, or you read the thoughts of Parmenides or Heraclitus, you're kind of stepping into another world entirely. There's also probably something having to do with language there, and the fact that Latin became, sort of the scholarly language of Europe, whereas Greek, it was the religious language in the East, but the Greek language is much more, there's much more movement to it. There's much more, it's a language of action. It's a language of flowing. And Socrates recognized this. That's why he actually said the Greek language has certain conceptual errors at the basis of it, because it's too Heraclitean, right? Socrates makes that argument because he thinks that we need to be attuned to these forms, not to the flowing, changeable world, this Heraclitean view that nothing stands firm. So I guess, long story short, Nietzsche doesn't address the Romans a whole lot. I think it's probably because I don't know if he sees what Nietzsche really is looking for in the Greeks as a point of comparison with the modern world, or I should say a point of contrast, whereas I don't think he thinks the Romans really provide that. I mean, yes, they're pagans. Yes, they're still like people of the master morality during the early days of the Roman Empire, but I think ultimately he would say their practical mindset, their straightforwardness, the way that they structure their arguments and think, and their forms of literature, it's all much, much more familiar to us. And I don't really recall where he talks about Virgil or Ovid. Now, as regards the question about is the noumenon, is that a source of striving? Has that been enlivening? Has that directed us to seek truth or more power? I think a lot of this, if you've already listened to my response to Pratik's question, you can probably infer a lot of what I'm going to say. If we're just looking at knowledge as a way of mastering nature, as knowledge as a form of power, then Nietzsche is, he doesn't have any kind of, he's not critiquing that, I really don't think he is. What he is critiquing in the idea of a world out there is the severing of the thought from the will, the severing of the truth out there from our perception of it. And I would argue that, discovering infrared or atoms, does that actually take us beyond the empirical? Does that actually take us beyond our sense perception? No, we discover these things by inference or by indirect sensation of them, we might say. When you look at a particle through an electron microscope, it's not as if you're somehow again tearing away the veil of Maya and you're like glimpsing the pure reality. No, you're just you are still engaged in this process of seeing with an eye that sees and an eye which has been shaped by evaluative judgments, by the drives, by the impulses, by the will to power, etc. And I think Nietzsche would say that, to the extent that we did seek a greater knowledge of the external world in order to gain greater power over it, the fact that we discovered atoms and so that one day we might split the atom, that in a way is not directed towards an other world that is set above the world of appearances, the world of sensations. So Nietzsche's problem is precisely at the point where you superimpose this metaphysical reality that is separate from all of that, and which actually makes the mastery of the world impossible, or not impossible, but it makes it to where all the valuing that is possible within the phenomenal world is devalued. So I think you would say what's borne fruits has been putting many different sets of eyes on something, and this pursuit of power through the sciences. That's what bears fruit. To the extent science is dangerous or a source of nihilism, it's because it contains the ascetic ideal of wanting to superimpose this metaphysical reality. But I would say refer back to my answer to Pratik's question, because I think this answer alone would be insufficient, but looking at the passages I looked at when answering his question, I think will make all of this a lot more clear. So thank you very much. Good questions about science today. All right, we have Plentigaf, who asks, "Hi, Keegan. I hope you're well. I appreciate how extensively you've covered Nietzsche's influences, and having been inspired by this, I recently read Thomas Brobjer's book, Nietzsche's Philosophical Context, an Intellectual Biography, which touches on exactly this. Have you heard of it or Brobjer's work in general? I find him to be one of the best living Nietzsche scholars. I think it would be quite beneficial to look into this study because of just how widely Nietzsche read and the authors who are largely forgotten today that were major influences upon him. In particular, Speer seems to have been one of the main influences on Nietzsche in a creative sense, as is customary for Nietzsche. For example, Speer's falsification thesis, all our empirical judgments are false because they attempt to impose the necessity, unity, and timelessness of thought upon the contingency, plurality, and successiveness of sensations, very likely influenced Nietzsche's own. There are many other thinkers that seem to have influenced Nietzsche, or that he at least extensively read, about whom I hear very little, if anything at all, such as Julius Bonson, Eduard von Hartmann, Gustav Gerber, Ernest Renan, Georg Christoph Lichtenberg, William Edward Hartpole-Leckie, Otto Kaspari, and Hans Lassen-Martensen, etc. I apologize for the long list of names, but even this many is just scraping the surface of Nietzsche's reading. Thank you for all your hard work. And thank you, Plentigaf, for the question. You are absolutely correct that these influences get very little attention or play, even though some of the figures you mention are actually directly addressed in Nietzsche's work, such as Hartmann in Use and Abuse of History for Life, Renan in The Antichrist, and Genealogy, I believe. He definitely talks about Lichtenberg, although I can't exactly remember where. But yeah, the list of names that you give, though, there are several figures that I don't recall that he ever mentions in his published work or even in his unpublished work. And to answer your question directly, I have not read that book by Brobjer, which I hope I'm pronouncing his name right, but I've read some of his papers or essays he's written, or just things that he's published on Nietzsche that have been very helpful, and I've referenced his work, I believe, in the first episode I did on Plato, on Plato's Symposium, sort of talking about his sense of how influenced Nietzsche was by Plato. He also has, you can find where he's listed out everything that was in Nietzsche's personal library. And so he has really done a deep dive into these figures. And I think it was actually, it was from Gregory Whitlock, but also from Thomas Brobjer that I was put on to Friedrich Albert Lange, someone you don't mention, but who I think is a really important influence on Nietzsche, who also does not get mentioned a whole lot. But so this is another one of those answers where, in the grand scheme of things, I can't really say how I feel about his work. I need to read it. But again, I'll tell you what, this is another one of those where I'm going to put it on the list with Safransky and Lou Salome's book as something that I need to read and talk about on the podcast. Because everything I have read from Thomas Brobjer has been good. So I would feel at least comfortable in saying his work in general seems solid. And, just all cards on the table, full disclosure, most of the people you mention I have not read. And the ones that I have, like Hartmann, Renan, and Lichtenberg, I have not read deeply enough. And I want to get specifically into Lichtenberg. There will eventually be an episode on Lichtenberg. But what you say about Speer, I was not familiar with his falsification thesis, and that sounds... it sounds very comparable to Nietzsche's ideas, especially his sort of inversion of Platonism. So I will definitely look into their work as well. So thank you very much for the question. Hopefully with your question, as with many people who have asked me about reading certain things, I can at least sort of, even if I can't give you a satisfactory answer to the question in the moment, you have the consolation that I'm going to look into this more, and maybe it will appear in the podcast one day. Still can't make any promises about Gurdjieff. I need to know a little bit more about him. But as regards some of the figures you mentioned, and especially Brobjer, I think it's almost a certainty that the podcast will cover these works. So thank you again. And we have one final question from Robert Sullivan. Robert is a long-time patron and nothing but the deepest gratitude towards Robert. He asks, would you say that Schopenhauer's pessimism on life haunted and distressed Nietzsche throughout his career, even more than the life-denying, otherworldly ascetic ideal of Christianity? Was Schopenhauer always lurking in his mind, saying no to life, while Nietzsche was advocating yes? There was no synthesis to resolve this problem. Thank you for that one, Robert. And yeah, I think that... okay, so there's two ways we could look at this, right? There's the charitable way and the uncharitable way, right? The charitable way would be to say that Schopenhauer is a voice among voices in Nietzsche's head of, valid, I don't want to say valid, valuable perspectives from people that had been influential on him. And, he explicitly says this in the aphorism Journey to Hades, that Schopenhauer is one of these figures. And maybe you're suggesting he's like the central figure. He's even more important than otherworldly Christianity, that Nietzsche is debating with Schopenhauer. And I think that's at least plausible. I find that the ideas that I was once enamored with, those become the ones that I'm often debating with in my head after I get over them, right? Like, so when you have a past conviction, whether it might be, in my case, like Buddhism, I often find myself thinking, what would a Buddhist perspective be on this? And it's not because I'm like at war with Buddhism and I need to like take it down. And so I'm always like, how do I fight them? It's more just like, that is now a part of me. That perspective is always there. And it's a different one. It's a different perspective to the one that I currently hold and antithetical to it in many ways. But it's incredibly valuable to sort of like summon the Buddha and ask him what he would say about a given thing. And maybe Nietzsche's doing this with Schopenhauer. But this is sort of maybe the uncharitable interpretation of your question is that, the way you say he's lurking in his mind, saying no to life, is that Nietzsche is always sort of like trying to escape from this intuition that Schopenhauer's right. Is he always sort of like trying to stave off the demon of Schopenhauer saying yes, right? That it's sort of like a state of inner tension or stress. It's not just sort of a playful bringing forth of this perspective, but that he really is... he really feels the tension, and perhaps it's, in a way, the lady doth protest too much or something like that. I don't know if that's what you're saying, but there's different ways one could interpret this. And I would agree, there's no synthesis to resolve the problem. I would say, if I were to just take a matter-of-fact view of the situation, I would say, you're right, there's no synthesis. Nietzsche defeats Schopenhauer, right? His life affirmation conquers Schopenhauerianism, and it is truly a irreconcilable dichotomy. You don't synthesize it, you don't sublate it, you just defeat it, and you move forward. And maybe it routinely crops up, but you have to continually reconquer the Schopenhauerian within, or something like that. As for my personal opinion on this, I would say, just broadly, yes, I think Schopenhauer was there from the beginning to the end of Nietzsche's thought. And as influential as Schopenhauer is in so many ways, and as helpful as he is for understanding what Nietzsche is doing philosophically, he is like almost diametrically opposed to Schopenhauer. And the way that Deleuze says that Heraclitus in Nietzsche's work is opposed to Anaximander, that it's sort of this really... there's like a deep incompatibility between the two on like the most fundamental questions of existence. But that being said, I don't necessarily think he was haunted and distressed. I think he did, there's this concept I've been kind of circling around and bringing up. I've brought it up many times over the course of this Q&A, but where you know something undoubtedly to be true. And I should clarify, I'm not using truth in the Platonic sense here, that you know it to be an objective, mind-independent fact in the thing in itself, in the essence. When I say true, I simply mean undoubtable, in the sense where Nietzsche says, it's not required, what does he say? It's not required that our beliefs are true, but it's required that a truth is believed in. I'm probably completely butchering that. It's from Will to Power, where he essentially says belief is the thing that justifies truth, not that belief is justified by truth. I hope I'm saying that correctly. But, there's that formula in Plato, justified true belief. So we have a belief and then we justify it, we find out that it's true, and then it becomes knowledge. For Nietzsche, he essentially says, what's important, what is knowledge is what is believed in, and that is what justifies a truth, essentially, is that it is something that we can believe in. That's the problem with God and the death of God. The Christian God has become unworthy of belief. It's become unbelievable. We can't believe in it even if we want to. Is that true of everyone? No, but Nietzsche's talking about sort of a dawning awareness that the old God no longer is tenable. And so I guess I would just say that I think Nietzsche, I especially get the sense with his later writings, Beyond Good and Evil and Afterwards, the Genealogy, Twilight of Idols, the Antichrist, he is still tarrying with Schopenhauer. He's still debating with Schopenhauer. But the sense I get is that he doesn't seem haunted or distressed to me. It seems as though he has had an insight or a series of insights that has freed him from Schopenhauer. And I think a lot of it does involve the fact that Schopenhauer wants to separate the intellect from the will, right? That's the whole point of the will negating itself. How does it do that? Through the intellect. The idea, and I think he comes to see Schopenhauer as sort of like, he's in that story of how the true world finally became a fable, right? He's one of the types of philosophical dogmatism. And having recognized what Schopenhauer's about, he's also done this sort of psychological analysis of Schopenhauer and why he thinks the way that he does. And he's completely reoriented his worldview such that Schopenhauer is an ascetic, he's a priest in philosophical garb, and he understands Schopenhauer's metaphysical otherworld now through his logic of the priest and the ascetic ideal and all of these things. And I think once he grabs hold of the ascetic ideal and sees, really, this is the power of creating an other world. This is the power given to the certain type, the priestly type, when he affects this devaluation. Here are all the character traits. Here are all the physiological aspects of the priestly type. Here are all the things driving him. And I think he sees, really maybe what you're intuiting or seeing here is that when Nietzsche speaks of the philosopher as a species of priest, he's really talking about Schopenhauer. Maybe to some extent about Kant or Hegel or some other German idealists. It's mainly Schopenhauer. He really, and so it's like, I think Nietzsche had that insight into this is who Schopenhauer is. I've discovered this whole new picture of philosophy and what the philosopher is doing, and within that picture, this is what Schopenhauer represents. He's incredibly useful, but I don't think he's really haunted by it. And that in fact, as he enters his last year of life and the sort of the mania and euphoria of Turin, followed by his collapse into dementia, I think he is actually more struggling with Christianity. Not really ideologically or philosophically, but the fact that he's signing his letters as the crucified, and the fact that he called himself a martyr. He said it was a martyrdom to his migraines, and that he did feel as though, he understood what it meant to be a crucified one, I think brought him close to the figure of Jesus in a really, perhaps even an uncomfortable way, right? But that in a way that I think he felt he understood the crucified. I think he felt he really did. I think the real struggle within him is Dionysus versus the crucified. He says it as his final word. And, does the crucified also say no to life? Yes. The figure of Jesus in Nietzsche's, the religion of Christianity and his conception does say no to life. So, in some sense, if we wanted to smooth over the differences, we could say, well, it's all really the same thing. But I guess the important difference is that both Dionysus and Christ show us two lives of suffering and of being destroyed by the world, essentially. So I think that's why both were very close to his heart, the idea of the crucifixion and of being rent asunder by the Titans. They both tell the same story, but as Nietzsche says, it's the the meaning of the story, the interpretation, what is drawn out of it that is different. In the one case, a denial of the world. In the other case, a celebration of life and a faith in the continual renewal of life. And I think that will always be the struggle that was like the deepest within Nietzsche's heart. But that being said, as you rightly point out, he's always responding to Schopenhauer. Schopenhauer will always be a part of his development, and I think he stands for, I mean, in some sense, you could say he stands for like the end of philosophy, right? And when I say end here, where it all leads, when philosophy is just a representation of the gregarious values, the herd values, the nihilism underlying all of it, it eventually leads to this philosophy, which is explicitly nihilistic. And it's like he saw that this as like a subterranean aspect of all philosophical thought hitherto, up until the point of Schopenhauer, where the reason why he's so valuable is that he says it explicitly. This is what you were all trying to get out of philosophy, religion. Schopenhauer says, this is what you really want. The negation of the will. That's the thing. And, that's so useful for Nietzsche. It's so enlightening to Nietzsche because he says, wow, that is right. That is what they were all trying to get. The negation of life, the negation of the will, the ascetic ideal. Only I now recognize that that's a devaluation of the world. That's death. That's sickness. That's the degradation of humanity. And so I'm going to go the other way. All right, I think this has been possibly the longest Q&A I've ever done. I probably am going to split this into 2 parts. But thank you, everyone. Sometimes I put up a Q&A thread on Patreon, and I don't get that many responses. I was overwhelmed with responses on this one, and I am thankful for that because it means you're all engaged, you're all thinking, and I hope I've done a good job of answering all your questions. I know there's some probably better than others, some things I just don't know about and I can't answer, but I think overall it was good. I think it was a good session. Very grateful for all of you. I do these Q&As now primarily because of all of you and because I want to engage with you and interact with you and, be involved with your thinking and working through things. And I appreciate hearing all the gratitude that you show me. That is very, it warms my heart. Thank you so much. Amor fati, everyone. Signing off. If you enjoyed the Nietzsche podcast or found it helpful, you can visit us and support the show at patreon.com/untimely-reflections. The link is in the description. Or just share the show with any of your friends that you think might enjoy it or on social media. Thank you for your support.